Can I welcome members, officers and the public here in the gallery or watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the Environment Committee. Please may I remind participants in the chamber to turn your phones off or put them on silent, and can I also ask members and guests to ensure that any electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Can I ask the clerk to confirm any apologies for absence?
No apologies for absence have been received, Chair.
Thank you very much. Section 2, Declarations of Interest. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members?
Noted.
Thank you. And can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda? Tony. Assembly Member Devonish.
Tony's fine, Chair. Good morning. I should say many years ago, up until 2004, I was an employee of Thames Water, but that's an awful long time ago.
Thank you, and noted. Excellent. And moving on, Section 3, Minutes. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the last meeting of the committee held on 13th of July 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Section 4, Summary List of Actions. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the Environment Committee, as well as the additional correspondence sent and received? Thank you. Section 5, Action taken under Delegated Authority. Can we note the action taken by the Chair of the Environment Committee under Delegated Authority in consultation with party group lead members, namely to A, agree a letter to the Mayor of London on realising the opportunities from COP26, and B, agree a response to the Department for Transport's consultation on night flight restrictions?
Yes.
Thank you. Section 6, Climate Adaptation and Climate Risks in London. That now brings us to today's main item for discussion, which is climate adaptation and climate risks in London. Please can I welcome our first panel guests here in the chamber. We are joined by Alex Nixon, Wastewater Systems Strategy Manager, Thames Water; Charlie Wood, London Area Director, Environment Agency; Lily Matson, Chief Safety, Health and Environment Officer, Transport for London; and welcome back to Peter Dorr, Assistant Director, Environment and Energy and Head of Climate Change at the Greater London Authority. And joining us virtually is Professor Jason Lowe, OBE, Head of Climate Services at the Met Office. Welcome to you all, and thank you very much for joining us. I will start with the first question, as is traditional. And my first question is for Charlie from the Environment Agency. Charlie, what impacts from extreme weather, particularly flooding and rising temperatures, are foreseen for London based on current predictions for the short, medium and long term?
We're already seeing impacts now, and they will just continue to increase. So we're seeing, more flooding, more extreme weather. We'll see dry weather events and, more heat. I think the main thing that you can see demonstrate this with sea level rise is the number of times we've closed the Thames Barrier. So over the first 17 years, we closed the Thames Barrier 24 times, and then in the following 2 years we closed it 21 times and 50 times, which indicates the increase in sea level rise that we're seeing, and also the increase in river flows. So we're seeing some already increasing impacts, and it will just continue over time, really.
Charlie, and can I just clarify the difference between the intense rainfall and the Thames Barrier, because obviously they're slightly different topics, and what is the danger from intense rainfall?
Yeah, so the intense rainfall is that we'll see more surface water events like we've seen in July, and I'm sure we'll come on to some of the complications of the roles and responsibilities of who sees that, because the Environment Agency has an oversight for surface water flooding. The impacts will be more surface water flooding from those intense rainfall events.
Thank you very much. And jumping to our virtual guest, which is Professor Jason Lowe from the Met Office, can I ask you the same question, Jason? What impacts from extreme weather, particularly flooding and rising temperatures, are foreseen for London based on current predictions, both in short, medium and long term?
So I can answer that from the perspective of the climate hazard that we see. So we've already seen a significant amount of climate change. If we look, for instance, at the number of days London experiences over 28 degrees, that's doubled over the last 30 years or so. Sea level was mentioned previously. Well, sea level has been going up through the 20th century by around 1.5 millimetres per year around the UK. And over the last couple of decades, that's actually gone higher. That's gone up to around 3 millimetres per year. When we turn to the future, the size of the climate hazard, it depends on the emissions that we as a global community put into the atmosphere. And so we need to look at a range of scenarios. Those scenarios in terms of the climate response diverge as we go through the century. But just to put some numbers on that, by the middle of the century, and these are specifically for London, we could see a warming in the summer of the order of 1.9 to 4.1 degrees C. In the summer, we could expect reductions in seasonal average rainfall, somewhere between about 17% and 47%. In terms of extremes, the sort of events we've seen that have caused flooding, we expect an event that has a return period today of 2 years to increase in magnitude by about 30%. We also expect increases in sea level rise, with sea level increasing by up to around 1 metre by the end of the century. And in terms of the impacts that go with those, well, for temperature, we can expect impacts on infrastructure, including energy supply and transport. We expect impacts on people. Mortality is linked to high temperatures. But also at lower temperatures, there is an effect, for instance, on people's ability to work or take part in leisure activities. Flooding, we've talked about and heard from our Environment Agency colleague, but just to confirm, we would expect there to be reduced amounts of water overall over the season in summer, so there could be drought conditions, but at the same time, when it does rain, the rainfall could be more intense, so we'd also have to deal with the surface water flooding. One thing that often doesn't come up at these events is thinking about the imported impacts. So London is clearly connected, and there's the potential of impacts on supply chains, food supply from around the world.
Thank you. The effects of flooding are clearly really stark, Professor. Recently, I went on a LBC interview, and the presenter said to me, but London's always had flash floods. What would you say to those cynics or skeptics that say this is a consistent problem and isn't getting worse?
Yeah. So, firstly, there is a lot of variability in the weather. I mean, we all see that from day to day. And if we do look at the trend of rainfall anomalies, specifically for London, at the moment, we can't pick out that trend for London because the variability is likely obscuring the trend signal. If we look on a larger basis over the UK as a whole, then we can see increases in rainfall in the period from about 1975 to now. That is quite significant in both winter and summer. And also our basic physical understanding of the atmosphere and the way the climate system works gives us confidence that we do expect more of these flooding events in the summer.
Thank you. Moving to Peter Dorr from the GLA. Peter, what lessons can be learnt from recent extreme weather events in London, such as the flash flooding in July, and what actions are being taken in response?
Thank you, Chair, and good to join you today. Following the incidents on the 12th and 25th of July, as you know, the Mayor convened an urgent roundtable with key partners, so that included the CEO of Thames Water, the London Fire Brigade, London Resilience Partnership, leaders of affected boroughs and the Environment Agency as well. And the purpose really is twofold. One, it was to sort of explore the incidents themselves and the response to that, and ways in which that, was it effective, could it be improved? And secondly, to think about the sort of longer term challenges of events like this. How could we be more effectively prepared going forward? So the group's now met 3 times, and the principal focus to date has been on the sort of initial response, which has been led by the London Resilience Group. And I'm sure they'd be happy to give you more details on their sort of assessment of the response itself. But the sorts of issues that they have flagged for immediate sort of follow-up included things like streamlining flood communications, making sure that Londoners can reach a single point of contact when they experience flooding, actions to improve partnership response and communications and access and sharing of data. We also have written to government to stress the need for more adequate levels of funding, that's a new word, funding for surface water flooding, which is an area which is challenging at the moment to sort of access funding for due to its distributed nature. Also to encourage them to support us in rolling out the Drain London programme, the Sustainable Urban Drainage programme further from the 6 boroughs we currently have, and to support the development of a sort of early weather detection system, warning system in effect for Londoners as well. So the group is now sort of transitioning more to think about the longer term adaptation impacts and how we can be more effectively coordinated. So there is a task and finish group which is just being set up. It meets next week for the first time, which is going to be led by the Environment Agency. So Charlie is co-chairing it with Phil Glanville, Mayor of Hackney, and it will be a group of relevant partners, stakeholders meeting, and politicians to sort of look hard then at how we improve that strategic coordination of surface water flooding in London, what needs to be done, how we improve sort of the communication, how we help Londoners be more resilient, plus how we access sort of great levels of funding. So the terms of reference are just being finalised with London councils at the moment. But as I say, that meeting is next week. The main group meets at the end of the week too. On the 8th of October. And that's our sort of avenue, if you like, for looking at how we take those sort of longer term measures to improve things.
Thank you. And same question to Lily. From a TfL point of view, what lessons can be learned and what actions are being taken in response?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Looking at those flooding events of July, which were really significant and did have a real major impact on the transport network, there's sort of two levels, the operational learnings and then the more strategic learnings for how we prepare for the future. So in terms of operational response, we have done both sort of localised reviews on the London transport side of things and on the road network, and we're actually doing a complete pan-organisational review to learn some of those lessons. If we just look at the London Underground and rail side, there were a number of station closures and quite severe disruption to the transport network on both events. The kind of lessons we've immediately taken from those are perhaps, they're sort of more practical in nature in terms of some of our staff were having to clean stations without perhaps the best PPE that could protect them. So there's some very practical lessons about operationally how we manage those. But then also more strategically in terms of ensuring, for example, that we've got the right surveillance of any vulnerable assets that might be susceptible to landslips, for example. But the overall lessons are being pulled together and they will feed into our main strategic planning. And just sort of thinking about that and looking forward, if we look at those events, the transport network was impacted quite severely at the time, but was quite resilient. It was fully back up and running the next day. And I think that's a sort of lesson, it sort of informs what I want to say today, which is I think in terms of resilience and operational response, the transport network copes with the kinds of events that have been thrown at it to date. I do acknowledge in that we haven't seen the kind of shock rain that New York or Belgium or Germany saw. And for that, I feel we're very lucky. But we did cope and we're very resilient in the July events. There is further work to do in adapting a 150-year-old sort of transport system to the ongoing changes that we've heard about, the fact that this will be increasingly frequent. And that feeds into much more about the long-term planning in terms of modelling our asset resilience and ensuring that we have the right investment for that to ensure that it's truly adapted to the changing climate and not just resilient to ongoing events which are obviously going to happen more and more often. Finally, just to say, we are obviously part of these collaborative groups that are being set up. We are part of the post-event summits. We work very closely with colleagues such as the Environment Agency and the London boroughs, and that will be a key part of any response moving forward.
Thank you. And I hear you identify there that the differences between us and what's happened in Europe and New York is that we didn't have that exact shock rain because, of course, the same weather systems that caused the floods here were the same weather systems there. How confident are you that if we did have that sort of shock rain that the transport system would continue to be resilient? Or do you think there's specific work we need to do for that very sudden rainfall?
We do need to continue to absolutely look at our resilience to extreme weather events. And we have been. So, for example, last summer in 2020, there was a tragedy at Stonehaven in Scotland with the landslip and the loss of life on that rail network. And we immediately reviewed our heavy rain and flooding resilience plan in the wake of that. And subsequently, we have done in the wake of the July flooding here. So we continue to look at our operational response. Just in as example, out of the last summer event, one of the recommendations is that when any new trains start running the next day, they run at very low speed, at caution speed, just to ensure that there's nothing left on the track. So some of the changes will be quite minor, but we're continually trying to learn the lessons from how to respond to those events. I think those were very extreme events, particularly in Germany, where you saw very developed countries' assets and infrastructure being torn away by climate change. And I think that's a warning to us all that we need to take this really seriously and focus minds on it.
You made that warning be heard loud and clear. So if I can move to Alex Nixon from Thames Water, just for the same question finally, what lessons can be learnt and what actions being taken to avoid things in the future?
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to start by saying that we are very sorry for the impact caused by any failure of our systems that may have had an impact on our customers, and to express our deepest sympathies to anyone affected by the flooding. Our initial assessment is that our sewers did not fail. We believe they were overwhelmed by events greater than their capacity to manage, but we recognise there may be some distrust in us saying that, and we want an open and honest and transparent assessment of what happened that Londoners can have faith in, and therefore we have commissioned an independent review to get to the bottom of what really happened on those days. What was the rainfall, how did our assets perform, and what are the potential solutions? Now, I think we are a long way off, and it'll be interesting to hear from Professor Lowe as to getting a greater accuracy to these sort of weather warning forecasts. You know, we've had 70 yellow weather warning forecasts this year. Only 2 of those have actually led to any big impact. Very pleased to say that, but clearly predicting things like convective storm cells is a very, very difficult thing to do. And if we had stood up an emergency response to every one of those 70, we would be exhausted and we would have cried a lot of wolves there. So what we need is a system that is resilient, just as Lily was saying, to these very extreme events. I believe that trying to get all of that water underground is not the solution of the future. You know, we've tried that, we've dug bigger and bigger tunnels, and getting that intensity of water underground is simply going to get incredibly more expensive and incredibly more difficult to deliver. I believe we need to try and manage that water on the surface through a varied range of solutions, such as green infrastructure, careful flood routing, and importantly, helping Londoners become more resilient themselves. So individual property level defences. However, you know, this is why we have commissioned this independent review, is to actually look at international examples around the world of what other cities are doing, and to learn from the very best, because I think there's a lot out there we can learn from them. But there are clearly things in the interim that we as Thames Water can be doing. We can be improving our incident response, making sure we work better with everyone else who comes to the support of Londoners when these things happen, to be creating a smart wastewater network, so more telemetry in our system, so we are aware of when our systems are becoming overwhelmed, and potentially are able to use that very large drainage system to move water around, and also to work collaboratively with all the partners that need to be part of this solution. You know, I would flag that London's drainage system is not just Thames Water's assets. We are just at the bottom of the hill where the water wants to run to. It is a combination of lost rivers, main rivers, ephemeral rivers, highway agency, local authority, drainage, private drains, etc. And everyone needs to work collaboratively together to find a long-term solution to this challenge.
Your Assembly Member McCartney.
Yeah, can I just ask a clarification point? You said you're looking at a review. In my area, for example, there were some areas that flooded that had never flooded before, for example, Crouch End. And people do put it down to the lack of drainage. Will you be reviewing and feeding back to each local authority on particular areas Is that some work you're undertaking?
So two responses to that. Firstly, we are working with the boroughs to help them with their Section 19 responsibilities. So under the Flood and Water Management Act, local authorities are required to undertake a study into any significant flooding, and we are required to support them. So we held a workshop last week to help them with compiling that information. Secondly, as an independent review, we won't be directing them what to do. They will look at and receive evidence from all the different partners, and they will undertake what they believe is the right assessment to do. So I would strongly encourage them to look at areas, all areas that flooded, but it's not something that we as Thames Water can direct to.
Yes, I wondered if I could just ask probably Peter and Lillian, or maybe all the guests in the room. I mean, given the context that Charlie was just mentioning, which is that we know that the use of the Thames barrier has massively increased, and that obviously is a response to the changing climate, but obviously that deals with fluvial and sea and tide matters. But we've also seen these increasing very sharp rainfall events happening as well. And obviously it's great that this roundtable has taken place and that you're now talking about collaboration. Do you think perhaps we should have done this a bit earlier? Because I'm slightly conscious that we're listening to people talking about responses to something that I think we've seen changing now for the last 20 years, because people have been talking about the increasing use of the Thames barrier for some time. And if you take that as an indicator of change, it's not like it just changed in July of this year. And, you know, we have the London Resilience Forum, the London Resilience Partnership. I've looked at the risk register, and it seemed to be, you know, obviously if it happens, it will be high impact. But I just wonder, have we been treating this with the urgency that it needs? And perhaps then we'd be further ahead in knowing which one of the weather warnings of the 70 that we've received this year might then result in something that we need to respond to.
Shall I come in on that? So surface water flooding is something that we've known is a massive risk for London for a long, long time. And in 2007, we experienced some really serious flooding. And as a result of that, Sir Michael Pitt carried out a review of what happened. So this was across the whole of the country, but there was impacts in London. And one of the recommendations from that was to, you know, bring forward the Floods and Water Management Bill Act, which came into force, gave us a strategic overview of flooding and identified the boroughs as the lead local authorities, flood authorities. Following that, in 2016, after a review of the risk register in London, there was an extreme rainfall summit that took place, which identified a number of recommendations. And then more recently, last year, one of the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee chairs was asked by DEFRA to review you know, all the roles and responsibilities, the governance, the funding, etc., around surface water flooding. And in 2020, David Jenkins carried out that review. Now, the recommendations that came out of all of those various reviews are very similar to what we've experienced now. So, you know, around whose responsibility is it, where is the funding coming, how can we work together better? So I think that operationally, we're clear who should be responsible. It's just how it actually works in practice because it's a complicated remit. So, hopefully that sort of explains a little bit of it. It doesn't necessarily resolve the issues and move us forward in us being, actually being able to deal with these really extreme events. But there is clarity over who should be responsible in such events. Does that help sort of explain some of the history of some of the recommendations? So we had been, you know, yes, we have looked at it. I think raising the profile again with government is a good thing, making sure that the money and the resources are in the right place to actually move forward some of these recommendations.
I think that would be particularly helpful because we've discussed flooding here, and I think Alex has come in and spoken about flooding more than once over the last 5 years to the Assembly. And I think moving forward on getting that good collaboration, because it is a complex picture. What was really disappointing this time was seeing some people on the news saying, well, it wasn't our fault that this happened, it was somebody else's fault. And I really don't actually want to hear anybody from any department in London saying that sort of thing. But I just wondered if I could just raise one thing with Lily about the issue of the sort of bounce back and the response, because I think that might have been true of certain parts of the Transport for London network, but I don't think it was completely true of all of the roads, and in particular Rains Park and Queenstown Road. I'm going to pick on those two, and these are places where the road goes down under a railway bridge, and quite deep flooding occurred, which obviously is extremely inconvenient for pedestrians and cyclists. And a lot of people didn't feel that it would bounce back quickly because they were still being inconvenienced. And there are bus routes that certainly run along Queenstown Road because it is an area. So I just wondered, is there more that can be done in terms of seeing the network as a sort of holistic whole? Because obviously for pedestrians and cyclists, flooding is as difficult as it is for train passengers. Or bus passengers.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think it's really important to recognise the impacts on the surface network, because obviously the road network is where so many people in London travel, particularly pedestrians and cyclists. So I know that dip in the road very well, and I can really envisage how that flooding happened. What we know, so when we see a yellow weather warning, we have an operational response plan in place which works on a 3-2-1 counting down in days to the event. And as far as possible, what we can do is direct our engineers towards any asset faults where we know there's sumps or pumps that are inadequate, and then try to be as ready as possible. That doesn't cover all incidences such as those locations you mentioned. In many incidences, we can get pumping to those sites. On the two events in July that we mentioned, basically the conditions overwhelmed what was available. What we try to do in our operational response is, first of all, prioritise human safety. So if there's any risk that we think people will be at risk of going into those locations, then we prioritise protecting them from that, whether it's closing off the area or whatever is required. Protecting public transport services and people walking and cycling. So there's a clear hierarchy in terms of how our operational response targets those efforts. It doesn't mean that all problems go away. And I think back to your previous point, clearly there's been a lot of work underway over many, many years. In preparing for this briefing, I've been looking back and just realising how long, people have been looking at this issue. It doesn't mean that these incidents don't happen. What we're trying to do is improve our operational response to it. And part of that post-incident review I mentioned is exactly to look at the road network and see what more we could do. One of the actions we're doing, it's not directly related to the situation you referred to, but there were a lot of stranded vehicles. And as the water receded, those become a safety hazard because people are going to reopen the road. So we're working with the London Fire Brigade, for example, to work on a protocol about how you retrieve stranded vehicles, how you get people safely from stranded vehicles. So it is, it's perhaps frustrating that we're not perfect in our knowledge and exactly where we need to be, but there is a learning process going on. And certainly those locations will be recognised as problem points for now and for the future.
Thank you. And I would imagine, Chair, that we'd probably be quite happy to receive a copy of your post-incident review when that's ready. And I know that obviously the same with your independent review, Alex. I think that would be very helpful for us going forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Cooper. I'm going to bring in Assemblymember Buckhara in a second, but Peter, I think you just want to add
Thank you. This is for Alex. I think
Peter just wanted to come off the back of that.
Sorry, it was just to sort of reassure you, the work hasn't just started today or, over the summer. It has been in play for a long time. So I look over to Alex, and who I used to work with many years ago, ploughing a very lonely furrow as the climate adaptation manager at the time, trying to get people interested in a topic which felt very far away at that time, I think it's fair to say. I think people are now beginning to realise the impacts of it. And I just wanted to sort of illustrate some ways in which we have proactively been working. So the Thames Estuary 2100 plan, which the Environment Agency lead, we are actively involved with that, and a number of other sort of stakeholders. We have helped make sure the land is available for a new Thames barrier when it's needed going forward, and that plan is constantly under review. It's under review at the moment. In terms of SUDS, we have produced a surface water flood risk map for London, which shows you where the opportunity, firstly, where the risks are from surface water flooding, and also where the opportunities for Suds are. And I mentioned already the Suds pilot, which we've worked with 6 London boroughs to demonstrate the impact that those small interventions can have in terms of helping support the drainage system that Alex referred to. Also, the London plan has in play, very, very strong policies on adaptation and flooding and overheating. So, for example, the current plan is reducing water runoff into systems by about 87% on new development. So, I just wanted to give you illustrations that there are a number of things already underway, and we will no doubt get onto more of those quite soon.
Okay, we're coming on to Mayor's Strategies and Initiatives shortly, but you've given us a spoiler. Assemblymember Bakari, apologies.
Thank you so much. So I'm coming from the perspective of residents, Alex, and I'm sure you're aware that there's been great talk about communication and working better with boroughs and councils, but there is a tension still, and I think I'd like you to be honest about this, between Thames Water and councils and how the communication works. Would you say that, the fact that there have been problems in London for many, many years, and in fact I'd say 20 years now there's been extreme flooding in certain hotspots, that Thames Water did have a responsibility, particularly in things like culverts, which haven't been looked at? There are some culverts that have been, neglected for decades. Where does the council and the Thames Water relationship work there? What's gone wrong with the communication? 20 years for a culvert for not to be looked at. How come the council didn't refer that to you? Why didn't it come back to Thames Water? Is the onus on residents to do this? That's the frustration, and I think a lot of residents find that so frustrating when they keep on hearing it's actually Thames Water that's supposed to be doing it and the council are not responding to it.
That's a very good question. I think, first of all, that there are a number of factors in this. I think the number one is not necessarily every asset has a clear ownership as to who actually owns and has responsibility for it. So there are large numbers of drainage networks in London where the drainage system passes through a number of different ownerships and not all of them are agreed. I think there are also areas where we have assets that are maintained according to a risk matrix that we have. So we look at, what is the actual likelihood of them causing a probability of an event, and perhaps we need to go back and look at that. I think also, there is. We have 110,000 kilometres of sewers, and that's 2.5 times around the circumference of the world, and we have to identify which of those are the highest priority. And there may be assets that we have not prioritised in the past, because when we've run that risk modelling, they have not shown to have had a major impact. And then when you experience these kind of extreme events, then they really do show that there is an impact that we weren't previously aware of. I think that this is something that we are working increasingly well with the boroughs to determine, and part of what local authorities have produced in their local flood risk management strategies is a list of all flood risk management assets, and we will be collaborating with them to produce that list and to ensure that then drives that clarity of ownership and maintenance and risk, so we can arrive at a much sort of more concerted position.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Assemblymember Devonish.
Thank you, Chair. Before I start my questions, I wanted to ask Thames Water if they could send us the terms of reference for the independent review, please. Thank you very much. My question for each of the panellists, but perhaps starting with Peter, is how is the London Environment Strategy so far making a positive impact on enabling London to adapt to the extreme weather impact of climate change we're now seeing?
Thank you, Assemblymember Devonish. So I started to touch on a few of these areas already, but there's a number of things we've put in place since the London Environment Strategy was published. I mentioned the London Strategic Sustainable Drainage Systems pilot, which is a pilot with 6 London boroughs, so Camden, Enfield, Hillingdon, Kingston, Southwark and Westminster. And what that project is doing is showcasing the importance of local distributed systems, which typically are difficult to fund through routes of funding, so through the Flood and Regional Coastal Committee. Typically, they're looking for some quite big impact projects, and it's hard to demonstrate that with relatively small interventions where you're talking about sort of 20 to 50,000 pounds of investment. And so we have worked with those boroughs to sort of look at the impact and where you could locate those interventions and what the impact would be in terms of benefits. So just to give you an example there, the work to date, we've identified a £20 million investment, brings about £280 million of benefits in terms of flood protection and also natural capital benefits too. And that's been really important in terms of, one, helping boroughs to understand the opportunity more, and highways agencies and other authorities, but also that has unlocked £1 million of funding from the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee specifically to fund those sorts of interventions. And we want to see that rolled out across the rest of London. So that's why we've written to the Secretary of State for Environment, looking for support to allow us to do that across the whole of London to help unlock more of those interventions. We have invested directly through the Mayor's own programmes. There's clear connections between surface water drainage and biodiversity and greening. I think we've talked about this a few times, but the Grow Back Greener programme, for example, has invested about £1.8 million directly into surface water flooding projects, but about £13 million into greening projects in total, which have benefits for adaptation too. We've introduced heat alerts, which we've had to use 5 times since we introduced it. So that's guidance to Londoners, which gets triggered in line with Public Health England guidance, and that includes alerts on sort of major public places where they can be picked up. Last year we launched climate vulnerability risk maps. So again, with our sort of limited resources, we are thinking about where we can make the biggest impact. So we have assessed the climate vulnerability, so the environment impact of things like heat risk, flooding, access to green space, air quality, but we've also mapped that then against the social vulnerabilities, so age of population, unemployment deprivation, etc., so that we can really identify where in London we should be investing our efforts. And so that map is now helping us to target our interventions in the second term, so the Future Neighbourhoods programme, our Green and Healthy Resilient Streets programme, our Grow Back Greener programmes are now being targeted more in those areas, and we're asking boroughs and others to demonstrate how they sort of fit with that approach. Suds Guidance, we've produced 6 separate Suds Guidance publications across schools, social housing, hospitals, parks, green spaces, it's commercial buildings, offices and retail, which is helping make the case and show how these interventions can be made in practice. I mentioned the London Plan already, which is bringing in very robust planning policies around overheating and around flood management. So, for example, we are asking in developments that they think about how they manage out overheating in the design of a building. The Crystal, funnily enough, New City Hall is a very good example of that, where the building, the orientation, the facade are all thinking about where the sun is in the day and trying to keep out that sort of solar gain. We also, the opacity of it's a glass building, but the opacity of the glass is different depending on where you are. So there's a range of ways in which you can sort of manage this through the planning system. We're also working through our retrofit programs to make sure that homes are properly ventilated, so to deal with overheating as well. I've mentioned the Thames Estuary 2100 work. We've also produced a surface road runoff map for the outer London borough areas to understand where those challenges with contaminated water entering sort of rivers, where they are. So again, we can map that with our SUDS interventions. And in the second term, we have just announced, with the support of Thames Water, an extended Grow Back Greener programme. So that's £1.8 million of interventions around adaptation, plus a £4 million Green and Healthy Resilient Streets programme, which is closing today. So we're hoping to get some very good applications. That's funding slightly bigger interventions around urban greening, but also contributing to improving adaptation. So around about 250 to £750,000 worth of investment. And also I mentioned the Future Neighbourhoods programme, which is a £7.5 million programme supporting the boroughs to showcase how they can connect up a number of environmental issues, from circular economy, air quality, greening, adaptation, energy, in a local area, engaging their local communities with a view to sort of developing models that can be become best practice and exemplars and are showcases for other boroughs. I'll stop there, I think. Otherwise it will be next year. Phil.
Tony, thank you. Thank you very much. So I think just to come at it from the purpose, so the point of view of a functional body, and think about what the importance of these strategies are for organisations like TfL, I'd say they're very important. The London Environment Strategy, the Mayor's Transport Strategy, really shapes the context in which the organisation thinks and directs its efforts. And having been very closely involved in the strategy and direction of the organisation as we've taken forward those plans, I would say, if you just want to sort of know what the sort of the impact is, it has a big impact. Basically, it means that the organisation thinks about these things, and if that what that translates to sort of is both across the Mayor's Transport Strategy and the London Environment Strategy, is absolutely the focus on seeking to reduce our carbon emissions overall, with a very clear commitment to zero carbon railway by 2030, to modal shift towards more sustainable modes. And at the heart of that is the whole healthy streets approach that we set out within the Mayor's Transport Strategy, which is integral really to a resilient and adapted future in terms of ensuring our streets have shade, ensuring that the very way that people travel on those streets is not worsening the climate crisis. And then within that, particularly looking at the subject of this inquiry around adaptation and resilience, those strategies give us a reason to report to our panels, to report to our boards in terms of how we're doing, and in a way holding ourselves to account. So we have had regular reports to our safety and sustainability panel on our adaptation readiness, and we will indeed be bringing a further one this winter on it. And then I think being required to hold that mirror to ourselves enables us to identify where we do have further work to do, and we do in terms of understanding fully our risks. We have adaptation to climate change as our number one strategic risk alongside sort of major events. And I don't think without the sort of strategic framework of the London Environment Strategy and the Mayor's Transport Strategy, we would have so much leverage to really focus attention on this. And if you think back to the case we are currently making to government around our need for future funding and the financial sustainability plan, it is based on the direction of a decarbonised transport network by 2030 and one that's resilient and adapted to climate change. So I would say these threads run through all of the work and direction that we're taking now as an organisation.
Thank you.
So I suppose Pete's covered off a huge amount of initiatives, which we're obviously heavily involved in as well, so I won't repeat any of those. And, just to echo Lily's comments, is that actually the London Plan and Environment Strategy are incredibly strong environmental policies to help London adapt and be resilient to climate change. I suppose the big thing for me is to see that actually happens in practice on the ground, especially around an increasing population, more development. Are we seeing those policies, actually play out? And we won't know that, for time, for quite a long time to come. But these initiatives that we're working on will help that. So some of the things that Pete didn't mention that we're also working on is with the Thames Estuary 2100 plan, looking at the future flood risk around Thames Estuary, is the Riverside Strategies approach. So a lot of the flood walls will need to be heightened over time. So how does London as a city interact with the river, and how do we, maintain that, adaptation from the flood risk that's going to come from the river. So the City of London has actually published the first consultation on the Riverside Strategies, and we're seeing some others coming forward, and we're working closely with everybody around the table, really, to make sure that those really think far into the future. And, I'm looking at the Tower of London there and taking into account those really historic parts of the city as well. And Lily touched on sort of, future funding is another really big thing. Funding's really stretched for all of us. So one of the things that I'm doing is I'm also a London Sustainable Development Commissioner, and sit on the Green Finance subgroup of that to look at new funding initiatives. And we can't just rely on government to fund a lot of these schemes going forward. So what are the other ways that we can do that? And I'll finish there, because I think Pete covered most of the things I would say.
Can I just ask you, you were very complimentary about the GLA and TfL strategies overall. Is there anything that needs to be improved? As we obviously, there's lots to do, and COP26 is in a month's time. Is there not one thing you say they need to improve on? You were incredibly complimentary.
Oh, no, and we were. And I think part of that is because we do work in really close partnership. So, I've had staff spending most of their time sitting with, both Lily and Pete's officers to write the policies that we would want to see. And actually, at the time of them being written, they were more progressive than some of the government policies. So I'd say they're very strong. I think the issue is actually seeing it playing out on the ground.
Thank you. And Thames Water, please.
It's difficult when you're the last on the line there.
Yeah, sorry.
I also probably have to declare an interest that as a former employee of the GLA, I had quite a hand in writing earlier versions of the environment strategy, so I might be inadvertently criticising myself, and I might need to plead the Fourth Amendment. But as Charlie said, we have worked closely with the GLA to help shape and influence those. I think I've sat across a number of similar scrutiny sessions, sometimes agreeing with Pete, sometimes pushing for more. But I think the combined weight of mayoral strategies are pushing in the right direction. I think events like this are things that we hadn't necessarily planned for. And one of the things I'm hoping that the independent review will come out with is to say, what is the right level of resilience that we should be planning for? Because currently, London's drainage system is pretty old now. It would be in a museum if it was in America, but it's something that we rely on here every day. We need to be looking at what is that next generation of drainage that we need, and does it all need to be subterranean? We need to understand what is the level of protection that is acceptable to Londoners, and how do we best deliver that? And is Thames Water the only partner in doing it, or is it a composite of all the local authorities, other emergency responders and developers, etc., to do it? So I think that perhaps has got to be the next focus, and my anticipation is that the independent review will point us in that direction and have to raise potentially a national level discussion about what is an acceptable level of resilience and how do you achieve it. Because if we say we move to a 1 in 50 year level of resilience, or Copenhagen is aiming for a 1 in 100 year resilience plus an allowance for climate change, that is a fundamental change in the makeup of your city and the attitude of the citizens of the city. So for me, the challenge is how big do we want to think and how urgently do we need to deliver it?
Thank you. And my next question is to Peter, which is probably the most important question from my opinion, which is ultimately who is responsible. A.M. Cooper touched on, is it the boroughs, is it Thames, is it the EA, etc., etc. And so the question is, how much of the power to adapt London to extreme weather is within the mayor's control, and how would that change with new powers for the mayor? Do you believe the mayor should be ultimately responsible rather than those bodies?
Well, that's a good question. It is a really complicated and complex sort of ecosystem. We're spending a lot of time on flooding today, for example. And it's probably just worth setting out very quickly what the mayor's sort of role in this is. So the mayor is required to produce a London environment strategy, which has policies and proposals related to climate adaptation in the capital. What the mayor doesn't have or isn't is he's not a is not Strategic Flood Authority. That's the Environment Agency's responsibility. We're not a highways agency with responsibility for drainage across their networks. We're not responsible for the drainage network. That's Thames Water. The London boroughs are the lead local flood authorities. So there's a range of complexities there if we take sort of the other kind of issues around adaptation. So the other sort of challenges really facing London are potentially around drought. Again, the responsibility is with Thames Water, and we don't have a formal sort of responsibility there. Equally, there is no authority with responsibility for overheating risk in London or in fact anywhere. So I think the answer to your question is that certainly in the short term, that's not going to change.
Are you asking for new powers?
No, I think what we need at the moment is more effective coordination across all of the authorities involved. So the surface water flooding incident recently is a great example. What is clear is there is a need for a more integrated, effective plan for London. So the lead flood authorities are required to sort of cooperate. But, can that be strengthened? Does that really take account of the whole of London? There's a whole number of stakeholders involved in that who will continue to have a role. So I don't think it's quite as easy as, giving the mayor the responsibility, because, the levers for this don't and won't sit with the mayor going forward. So I think that coordination is important. Driving a collective approach to setting out the challenge and how we solve it, and making that case for sort of greater funding are the kind of key things, as well as continuing to develop that evidence base, which we've worked hard with others, including the boroughs, to do. But it's by driving that evidence base that we make the case for sort of greater interventions here, and we unlock more money. So I think the focus really has to be on that, rather than sort of chasing sort of powers which would require very significant changes to sort of government legislation. Where we have the power, we are intervening. The Transport Strategy, the London Plan, and where we don't have the power, we see our role very much as convening, collaborating, working with others to support delivery.
And do you think you should be communicating, or rather the mayor should be communicating more of the earlier very impressive list of all the things you talked about, like the Suds pilot project? Because people like us vaguely know about it. Londoners don't know. And when you go on the tube, it would be a good opportunity that you had a poster saying all the things you're doing. Do you think the mayor could do more in terms of the communication side at least?
I certainly think there is more to be done around awareness raising of Londoners and London's businesses, not just what we're doing, but a number of really good and impactful things are happening. It is challenging getting that message across, and I think that's certainly an area we are looking at through the new group set up to look at adaptation going forward with the EA and the boroughs. So I think absolutely that's an important thing, is how do we effectively get the message out there that this is important, Londoners need to take action too, and these are the things we are doing to make London more resilient. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Best.
Thank you, Chair, and I think Peter's actually done a good job of answering most of my questions, and with an eye on time I'll try to be concise. But Peter, I just wanted to know if you have been able to be involved with the London Plan at all, with planning officers, and how closely you get to have a say in that.
So we review all strategic plans which come to the mayor, and we'll make assessments of the development against the policies of the plan. So that's not just adaptation, that's energy and climate change, that's greening. A whole range of policies are assessed, and we feed that into planning colleagues. And so where there are issues, we will be raising them and then working with planning colleagues to make sure those are sort of raised through the planning process. I think I gave the example earlier, which I think is a really good one, of where that planning policy is really starting to bite and have an impact, which is about sort of reducing sort of runoff from new development essentially into the hard sort of infrastructure we have. So about 87% of water now isn't draining off into those systems through new development. So I think that's a really good example, and we are putting together checklists now so we can get better data back on the performance of the plan in the development phase.
And what concerns, if any, do you have around urban warming and tall buildings being built closely together in close proximity?
You mean sort of in terms of urban heat island type effects?
Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, that is clearly an issue, and we have a number of things in play already. The Cool Spaces programme, which is helping. Obviously, it doesn't solve the challenge, but it helps Londoners if they are out on hot days to find areas of respite, both indoors and outside, areas which are cooler. In terms of new development, that is factored in. So we are looking at how new development can reduce its contribution to overheating of the city. We're just about to commission some work to look at the potential for a cool roofs programme as well. So looking at the evidence for doing that wherever cities have taken action, how that could work and what the cost would be. So yeah, it's certainly on our minds. You know, I think the buses are a really good example of a sort of very practical action of something that can be done to help with overheating, painting very simply, you know, painting the roofs of the buses a different colour to reflect the heat. But yeah, there's again a range of things underway to help with that.
Peter, I think that's the right words. Hopefully it's put into practice more this term then.
Thank you. Assembly Member Cooper.
I just wondered, in terms of the Mayor's strategies and initiatives, there's an estimated 25% of Londoners who don't have flood insurance. Is there anything that the GLA can do to address this? Perhaps we often talk about, you know, adverts being placed on the tube, or any kind of awareness raising campaign that the GLA could undertake, because obviously not having flood insurance and then being flooded, it's devastating being flooded in any case in your home by anything, but it would make quite a significant difference for people's recovery from the flood if they do have insurance.
Again, I think that's a really good point, and it links to Assembly Member Devenish's point. It is something I think we need to look at and explore around sort of the resilience of people and property. So again, it is in the play of the group we are starting next week. So yes, I think there is something there, I'm sure, around how we get that message across about the importance of this, and it is a growing risk to Londoners, so we'll certainly factor that in.
I mean, we have a panel later where we're talking to people from local authorities,
yeah,
and it's pretty much the same question for them, but maybe it's something, Chair, we could write to the Mayor about, to see in what way the GLA could help with getting that message out there, because I think it does make a significant difference to people. Thank you.
Thank you. On that same question, Charlie, if I can come to you, there's a really interesting report from the JBA, which is a retrospective look at London surface water flash floods. And in this, it talks about Assembly Member Cooper's point about insurance, and particularly for people living in basements, for instance, where often high-value goods are kept. How do you balance that along the needs and costs for warnings and things like that? And how can we make sure that Londoners are protected?
That's a really good point. I was just going to add to the point before that we do run a flood awareness campaign each year, so we do that nationally. But recently we've been doing it in London with the GLA, and it escapes my brain, but I think it was 2 years ago we did focus it on surface water flooding. So you know, I think maybe, you know, your point about insurance is a good one, that we could think about how we could talk specifically about insurance. I think we have to be realistic about the population of London, you know, and I've mentioned this before on some of the round tables. You know, it is a transient population. You know, it is difficult to raise the awareness. I mean, we see it all across the country, but London as a sort of national city, I think, is even harder. So English isn't the first language. You know, we need to find different ways of sharing that message and making it, you know, something that people need to understand and need to take action. Some of our national messages do not apply to surface water flooding, around have a grab bag, you know, those kind of things. But raising your important belongings up is also, you know, something that's relevant regardless of where you, you know, what kind of flooding comes in. So yeah, that was on the previous point. Sorry, I'd completely forgotten what you'd asked. Your second point, it was around protecting people.
Yeah, it was particularly about this kind of balance between the cost of warnings and making sure that we're adapting for Londoners.
Yeah. So something that we are doing is we're releasing some new flood maps, and the quality of our flood maps, so who's at risk, is constantly being updated. So the next version will have better information around surface water risk. But it's, you know, it's the warning and forecasting for surface water flooding, as Alex sort of highlighted, it is complicated. So it is something that we're working really closely, you know, with the Met Office in our flood forecasting centre. But also there are lots of private organisations that are looking at that as well and creating a competitive market on it. So, you know, it is a tricky thing to give that prior warning and then for people to take action. There are some initiatives coming forward, so the cell broadcasting, which is where a message gets forced to your phone, and you can do that within a sort of postcode area, but how that will work in London, how do you not sort of scare people and sort of mass panic and things like that, you know, are issues that we need to work through. And also the point that Alex made of standing people up too often, you know, that they won't listen in the future. So, you know, how do you target specific locations and know that an impact will happen and therefore they will take action? It is a big, big issue. So yeah, it's balancing all of those things and making sure that we target in the right place. I think also planning is a big issue that Pete touched on. So the implementation of the planning policies in the London Plan. We've recently published and regularly publish planning applications that have gone against our recommendations. So we're a statutory consultee, and there are quite a few in London that go against our flood advice. So, you know, that still happens. We try to get into understanding why those decisions have been taken against our advice. And it's something that I know I've asked my team to pick up with Pete's team to make sure that we talk with the local authorities and really understand why those decisions have been taken.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to hear that point about the maps. I spoke to the Mayor about this at our last question time and he responded positively. Yeah. That previously the maps haven't necessarily said what the flood risk is, whether it's surface water, whether it's tidal, whether it's fluvial. So it's really good for people to know their specific risk. And also this report talks about the fact that sometimes these maps don't indicate where there's been basement flooding, for instance. That's not been tracked on a risk map or where there's been previous flooding. So it's really good to hear you'll look at that. I just want to turn to our scientist, Professor Lowe from the Met Office, just to finish this section off, because obviously forecasting is hard. We have these warnings, and very often they're quite broad warnings, but London needs local specific warnings. How do you kind of measure that, and how do you adapt to that?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's really two timescales here we probably want to talk through. One of them is thinking about the climate information. So the climate information, we've moved to a much more detailed spatial model. So now we use the type of model that previously was used for weather forecasting as a grid scale of a couple of kilometres. We can use that for climate. So firstly, our climate projections are coming down to a much finer scale than they did before. And there's further research going on that on detailed modelling for London. When it comes to the nearer term warnings, we've seen improvements over the last 3 decades in the accuracy of the high resolution forecasts. And I think that will continue with techniques, for instance, around nowcasting. But the key is then translating that information. So, for instance, we heard earlier discussion of the yellow warnings. Those are very much our probability-based warnings, and that means they can show, for instance, a high likelihood of actually a low impact event, or a low likelihood of what could happen in terms of high impact events. And so getting the understanding of what that means locally, I think is really helped by 2 things. I think it's helped by the network of civil contingency advisors. So, for instance, as one of those works with the London's Resilience Forum to translate the message. Once a weather warning is triggered, there is a much more intense dialogue and techniques like the hazard mapping portal. There's also the relationship with the Environment Agency. So we work very closely through the Flood Forecasting Centre to provide as localised information as is credible.
Oh, I think we've lost the professor. Sorry, we just missed the last thing you said.
Yeah, I'm not sure how far you got, but I was emphasising the importance of the Flood Forecasting Centre and working closely with the Environment Agency to ensure we can say information on as local a scale as is credible from the projections.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. My questions are for TfL, so Lily, and you've talked a little bit about what I wanted to ask you already, but the concentrations of heavy rainfall we've had recently, is there anything else that you want to see in the Mayor's strategies and plans to deal with that heavy rainfall and increased risk of flooding?
Thank you for raising that, because actually I think it relates directly to the subject we were just talking about in particular. It's not so much that we need new things in terms of strategies, but quite often the data or the modelling or the very information that we were just hearing about is often in formats which are very difficult for transport planners or designers to easily translate into very localised design solutions. And we've been talking a lot about surface water flooding because I think it's very top of mind, but it's very granular. And one of the things we struggle with is having, what I mean by granular, it's very localised in nature. And for us to have enough granular information and data to know exactly what the risk is to this tube station or this railway line, if I'm honest, we don't, although we're all talking, we don't readily have that information available in its most up-to-date and form, i.e. containing absolutely everything we need to know about the most up-to-date climate projections. So for me, the priority is more about better data, ensuring that we can lucidly and easily understand what the Met Office is saying and understand what it means in terms of us being able to design a response to that effectively. And we need to, we have talked a lot about collaboration. I think all of us need to go at that with some urgency and real commitment to actually making things actually happen now on the ground. And I think we have got that now for the back of the July events. But we had, after the Mayor's Transport Strategy, we set up the Transport Adaptation Steering Group, which we chair, and it includes all of these representatives and the boroughs. And it is a very good forum, but it should become a real nexus for actually saying, okay, we commit to doing these kind of change. And then ultimately, I can't get away without talking about funding. We really, really need to make not only the climate emergency, but this part of the climate emergency, adapting and being a resilient city, a city where 8.5 million people live, an absolute priority for funding from the government, because we're doing all we can to translate to net zero, and we will get there as best we can with the funding we have available. But if we haven't adapted to the changes that have already happened, we'll still not be a livable city. So we really need to raise the profile of this in terms of its priority for funding.
Can I just take up that point about the data? You wanted it more granular, and you said to localise to a particular tube station. Does that data actually exist? Is it available? And who does hold the data? We heard from Mr. Lowe at the Met Office that there is someone in the Resilience Forum whose job it is to translate that in information that the Met Office are given. But who should hold that?
So I'll comment, but the gentleman,
Yeah.
Jason, I think it's Jason,
No.
Professor
Professor
Lowe
Lowe,
was
yeah.
waving his pen behind. I don't know if you noticed that as well. But I mean, the issue is I don't think it does exist at the two level.
Yeah.
But we have our own flood risk models, and we need to inform them as best we can with the latest information on heightened flood risk coming from what the Environment Agency or the Met Office understand about climate projections. And I think we're finding a bit of difficulty in is translating what some of those latest projections and modelling of that means to our localised models. So that would be a practical example of where we could better join up and have that information flow.
Thank you. I don't know if Professor Lowe is still on the line.
Yeah, I'm still here. Sorry, I got momentarily cut off. If I could just respond to that.
Yeah.
So we're talking about risk there, bringing together the hazard information on weather with local vulnerability information and the exposure information, for instance, on a local tube station. The very high resolution climate data, so we have of the UKCP set more than 5,000 users picking that up, and it is available in a number of formats, but we're always very keen to hear from users how we could make that more accessible. And I'm aware there's now a piece of work going on specifically with TfL to provide an additional format of that data, so it's more easy to import it into GIS systems.
Okay, that's helpful. Hopefully that
Yeah.
will help. Can I also ask that one of the things I think that the two flooding events this year actually showed us was that there's some sites that are particularly vulnerable. If I take my constituency, Turnpike Lane Tube, for example, it's one of those stations where we had pictures of water rushing in at a tremendous rate. What can you do to, I suppose, to do preventative measures once you know there are specific sites that are particularly vulnerable? And are you working on plans for such sites?
Yeah, so we do, I referred to a few things. So one is our heavy risk and heavy rain and flood resilience model, resilience plan, which tells us really how to prepare and adapt, react in the moment. But we also have a London Underground comprehensive risk framework for flooding as well, which is exactly looking at the vulnerability of different assets across the network. So we do know which stations are, or which parts of the network indeed, are more vulnerable than others. And that then would include several responses. So is to understand the level of that risk, to understand if that's a whole asset risk, like an embankment, for example, or more to do with localized risk around a station. And that will feed into different actions. Do we need to reinforce a structure or an embankment, for example? And what are the tactical local responses needed in a station, for example? So a few stations have floodgates, but others where we know that it might be an ongoing risk, there will be a program where we know we can go and direct, for example, our emergency response unit with extra pumps and flood boards and other ways to help protect it. So a lot of that knowledge is held in terms of we know where we're vulnerable, and we can, because we do this 3-2-1 operational response model I talked about, we can try to direct as much as possible people to be ready in advance. But one of the real dangers, I think, one we're very alert to after the July flooding, is back to that granular understanding. It could be already at Turnpike Station, and then the rogue event could happen somewhere else. And what we are vulnerable to is the changes to the surrounding environment. So there is the continued paving over of London, and that is changing the local hydrology. And so you can have surface water changes in terms of flooding in a way that you might not have 3-5 years ago. So you can, it's how we stay on top of those events. And that is very flashy, if you like, in terms of the flooding, and it's very difficult to preempt. So in that respect, it's all about making sure all of our staff know what to do in terms of those responses. And we also used our control centre, so the London Underground Control Centre, the Network Management Control Centre, which literally has real-time visibility of the entire transport network, to be able to respond in the moment, send the emergency response unit to those locations if something should happen.
Thank you, Chair.
The Member Bukhari.
Thank you. This is also for Lily for TfL. My Pacific area's surface water flooding on the road network that I'd like to ask you about, and all the properties alongside it, but specifically also about the drains and the gullies along the red routes. What's the plan there? How are you reviewing it? And what are the timescales?
So, obviously very important that we keep the strategic routes safe and moving for all users. So in the run up to an event that would be indicated as a yellow weather warning, we would ensure that gullies are cleared. We can deploy in advance gully suckers and other things to try to, as far as possible, ensure that we are ready and to fix faults. In both the events that we're talking about, the level of water, these are, I think it's between 1 in 30 or 1 in 60 year events, as they were overwhelmed by the level of water.
Are you not doing this regularly anyway?
Yes, we are, but what I'm saying is that when you get a very high intensity rainfall event like that, the drainage system is actually overwhelmed, so you are getting surface water literally running on the surface. So that we need to... we recognise that, and it's really how you respond to that safely then, in terms of whether you're closing roads or diverting traffic away from it. But just remind me what your question was.
I'd like to know really your strategy when it comes to clearing the drains on the red routes. Yep. It sounds like you're being reactive.
No, so thank you for reminding me. So there's two things underway. So one is there is I think, as our colleague from Thames Water mentioned, the assets are incredibly complicated, what's under London streets. There is a risk assessment going on of the surface water, the surface road network to basically inspect and try to understand fully what the asset risks are. But it is about looking ahead and trying to see where we need to improve or enhance drainage. But what I was also sort of saying is it's an recognition that in the moment of some of those extreme events, even with good drainage, even with pump stations working at capacity, the level of water that flowed it did overwhelm it, and I don't think you would ever be able to plan for the level of...
So what you're saying is that despite the strategy that you have for clearing drains and gullies, the drainage system is still not good enough to deal with the situation?
No, I think it is, by and large, it is good enough. What I think we've seen with these extreme events is that you get very intense issues happening, which is why Thames Water, for example, was talking about its drainage system being overwhelmed. But what we can do, and at the strategic level we're working towards, is the whole sustainable urban drainage approach. So that's about not relying on just endpoint drainage, but obviously trying to make London more of a sponge city. So we play a part in that through our own tree planting along our network, and we're working hard to achieve the targets that we've got.
Do you have a timescale, as I asked before?
For what in particular?
For achievable targets, to make sure that that there are systems in place to help with the drainage, for example.
So we have clear plans to ensure that the network is safe. I guess what I'm trying to explain is that I think with the level of crisis that we're facing, in terms, I don't think I could ever guarantee you, hand on heart, that there wouldn't be flooding on a certain part of the road network, and I don't think Thames Water could do that, or neither could the Environment Agency. What we need to do is ensure that as far as possible, we're working collaboratively to improve the drainage overall of London.
So is there a plan perhaps then to do something that is proactive in terms of maybe you are responsible for pavings, could they be made more porous and have certain materials that are used that are going to help? Are you looking into tree planting along the red routes? What are you doing that's actually going to help this situation?
Thank you for helping me, Stuart. That's really helpful. So on all of those, yes, we do have targets, and we are moving forward. So in terms of tree planting, the Mayor's Transport Strategy set a target to increase the overall coverage by 1% a year, and we are on track with that. Even though last year it was hard to get out and about, the levels of trees were planted. In terms of that sustainable urban drainage, I mentioned there's a target again within the transport strategy to increase that by 50,000 metres squared a year, I think, capacity. And again, we're working with the boroughs and others to work towards that. And in all of those elements, as well as ensuring our asset resilience, which is back to your original point. So in our current discussions with government and in the financial sustainability plan, what we have prioritised above all else is asset resilience, to make sure that we have the money and the funding to keep London safe, and that's the road network as well as the rest of the public transport network. And that is based on an uplift actually in spend on our assets, and that will include the drainage, because that's the absolute basic level that's needed.
Would you also look into cycle routes as well, using porous materials, and is that happening at the moment?
Yeah, no, we would. And in terms of porous paving, so they're definitely, we are trialling that, and we have looked at that. On some of the main carriageways, the most heavily trafficked roads, it hasn't proved that durable, but on cycle routes, as you said, it might, where there's less weight from the vehicles, there is potential for using it. It's very much one of the mixes that our asset engineers are looking at and trying to use as much as possible alongside the green infrastructure, which obviously has a key role to play.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Peter. How is the Sustainable Drainage Action Plan progressing, and what impact is it having now on surface water flooding?
Can I just have one point before I answer that one? Just to say, colleagues here at City Hall and the London Infrastructure Group are also, doing some really good work with utility companies in their sort of works on roads where they need to dig up parts of London. In essence, they are, as part of that sort of planning consent and planning that work, they are working to identify where they can implement sort of local SUD schemes or permeable pavements, for example, as part of that programme. So there's some really interesting work going on with Cadent up in Enfield, which they're looking to sort of roll out much more effectively with other utility providers. So it's just an example. Some of the answers to this are opportunistic. We can plan for certain things and some of the bigger opportunities, but there will be opportunistic ways to sort of turn London into more of a sponge, to use Lou's sort of turn of phrase. So in terms of just turning to the Sustainable Drainage Action Plan, so there is the London Sustainable Drainage Action Plan Progress Report, which covers 2017 to 2021, which is on the website. But just some of the sort of key elements of that, which I'd sort of highlight. First is the publication of the Suds Opportunity Map for London. So that is sort of showcasing where we see the potential locations for SUDS interventions across the whole of Greater London. We have, as I mentioned a couple of times already, we've funded a number of interventions through the Grow Back Greener programme, which is ongoing this year, and as I mentioned again, is increasingly being targeted in areas which are most vulnerable. We've updated the London Plan. So there is now a drainage hierarchy and a much stronger stance on impermeable surfacing, which I've already talked about as well. And we are also we have introduced a SUDS planning pro forma. So we're able to sort of gather the information much more effectively on what the planning system is actually delivering as well. We've published a series of sector-based guidance for different sectors, so there's 6 of those in total, and we work with our networks across sort of the NHS and education and business to get that sort of out and promoted, and with the London boroughs. We've also been working to train highways officers. Part of this, it's not just about educating Londoners, it's also about educating highways engineers and others who work in this industry who wouldn't naturally think in this way because they've never really had to. So we've trained 300 officers, highways officers to date, and that work continues as well. And then finally, I just mentioned the planning,
Oh, sorry.
the
Go
London infrastructure planning work, which again is really important. So using that reinstatement of planned road closures to introduce new SUDS measures too.
And the creation of SUDS is to provide kind of an alternative to drains and sewers.
Yeah.
Many of the proposed schemes are fairly low cost. Section 106 agreements are there to compensate for the impact of housing and development. Do you think that the creation of SUDS should be a kind of part of the routine planning conditions for most of these developments, and a planning condition through funding via 106 agreements?
Well, I mean, certainly we push that through strategic developments. I think that's a really interesting question, and yeah, I see it's a really good opportunity, I think, for the boroughs then in terms of their own plans and implementation to certainly think about that. I would just sort of stress though with SUDS that it isn't, there's no sort of magic bullet to any of this stuff. So you know, for the very extreme events we've been talking about, you know,
so
SUDS
there are
interventions
cases where
will not sort of deal with 1 in 200 year extreme events.
I mean, there are cases probably coming up where there are planning applications coming through where actually there should be more of a consideration of the old Victorian pipes that are being used and the need for them to be replaced, would you say, rather than using SUDS? And would that
the network?
Yeah.
So again, we've, you know, one of the things we've worked very hard on and put a lot of pressure on Thames Water and Ofwat for is to improve London's ageing network, basically, and we've sort of worked to make sure that Londoners don't just pay the bill for that. So there was a £300 million offer via Ofwat to sort of improve London's assets, and that's recently been matched by Thames Water stakeholders. It's something the Mayor has pushed very hard for over the last 2 years.
Yeah, I'm just raising this because I think there might be a concern that there's a cheap alternative here using SUDS rather than replacing old Victorian pipes that need to be replaced.
Yeah, that has to happen too. There isn't, you know, SUDS will play a role, but it is not. It's not the sort of, as I say, the sort of silver bullet, certainly.
Can I come in there? So funding for surface water flooding solutions is a complicated one because, you know, as you say, they're quite small schemes in very specific locations. So at the moment, to bring forward a flood scheme through the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee, you have to bring in a certain amount of partnership funding, and you have to show that it's cost beneficial to bring forward the scheme. And that was always, you know, created on the basis of big schemes, you know, that would protect lots of people or infrastructure. And the schemes that we're seeing now, it's definitely, you know, harder to bring forward those schemes. So to do the modelling to prove that it's going to work. So something that the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee, so there are loads of them around the country, but the one that is important here is the Thames. Actually, because of the size of London and the amount of levy that it brings in through the boroughs, has quite a big pot of money to play with, and they've been incredibly innovative in the solutions that they've been looking at. And this is one of them, is that they've been looking at these strategic SUDS pilots, to look at a catchment level and said, how can we fund X, Y and Z to bring forward benefits, and not only for flood risk, but for multiple benefits, so for biodiversity, for health, social, etc. And they're doing that now to put forward a package to say to government, this is how we need to look in the future. I think part of that is that the big schemes have been done because they're sort of easier, because you can model them, you know the money's going to come, you can find the partnership funding from others, you know, to bring forward the scheme. Now the harder stuff is in play. The RFCC is also looking at natural flood management, so planting up, you know, trees, etc., higher in the catchment to absorb the water, because I suppose the sponge analogy is about slowing the flow, slowing it, you know, and trying to prevent it entering the system at all, the sewage system at all. So, yeah, I hope that sort of explains it a little bit better. You know, we're aware it doesn't work for these smaller schemes, and we're working closely with that committee, who is independent of all of us and represents everybody here, to find a solution and to put that to government.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh,
I'm aware that we're well over time,
Yeah.
so Pete, could I ask you to write to the committee about hospitals? I'm aware that Newham and Whipps Cross are both closed, so it'd be great if you could write to the committee about Suds and hospitals and the plan around that. If I can just remind everyone, if we can be brief and succinct, just so we can get through the business. Assembly Member Best.
Thanks. Sorry, my question will be to Charlie from the Environment Agency.
Thank you.
It's just scrolled. In the interest of being speedy, I'm not helping, am I? It's thank you. On the wrong page.
Just by asking us to be succinct.
What question number are we?
1.9.
We're 1.9.
1.9.
Oh, sorry, Charlie. How is the Environment Agency working with the Mayor and boroughs to support their efforts to halt climate change?
I think, you know, we've heard here today that we can't halt climate change. It is already here. You know, and we all need to work to adapt and create a resilient city. I think we've spoken a lot about how we're working together. I don't think that's, you know, necessarily the issue, but maybe a sort of sharper focus on some of those collaborative approaches and partnership working is what we need to move forward on now and try and find those real solutions to some of the problems. And yeah, so as Pete said, I'll be co-chairing this task and finish group, and I'll be looking to, you know, I think the important things are not duplicate what other groups already exist, and just be clear who's taking forward what and how we can actually find those solutions that are going to make a difference.
Thank you. And would you be able to comment in some more detail about that roundtable event with London councils and the Mayor and the Environment Agency that happened after the flash flooding recently?
Yeah, so I think we were all present at that, and it, you know, and it was a good event to look at the moment in time. At first, it was very sort of operationally focused. What did we all do? Should we have done more? Could we have worked together better? And there were absolutely some immediate lessons that we all could have learned. So one that jumps to my mind was that I think, you know, there was a call to have had a partnership call earlier on, and really talk about, bring together all of our partners to talk about the issue of the fact that we knew thunderstorms were coming, and also, you know, maybe to share the fact that thunderstorms are really tricky to know exactly where that water will fall, because you don't know where the thunderstorm will happen. But you know that it will happen over a certain area. So having those conversations, but, you know, we proactively worked with the boroughs and Thames Water, talking to them about the fact that this weather system was coming and that now's the time to get out and clear your drains and trash screens, which is what we did for the main rivers. But yeah, you know, we took that forward. You know, I think we had a meeting like the week later, and then I think 2 weeks after that. So we kept the momentum going in moving from the immediate to, right, what next? And I think it became apparent that actually the reviews that I mentioned previously, you know, they have taken place. And let's quickly look back at the recommendations from those, specifically the one, the summit that happened in 2016 around London. And are there immediate things that we can do that maybe, you know, we all haven't done together? So I think they've helped, you know, with the momentum and bring us together as, you know, to be as collaborative as we can. And the next phase, I think, we'll be looking further to the future.
Thanks. Just one question on that then. I was really interested talking about how you can, you know, when we know thunderstorms are coming, for example, better communicating this is happening. Was there any kind of key outcomes that came from that? Because I think that is one element where there's a real poor kind of breakdown and link up between councils and Thames Water of taking preventative actions before we end up in the reactive, with reactive measures.
Yeah. I mean, thunderstorms are very tricky, you know, for that specific location. So we spend, you know, a lot of time with the Met Office to work out the best way to communicate that information, the risk and the potential impact, and explain that. And I suppose, you know, and we get out and clear those gullies and streams for the main rivers, because obviously the impact can be, you know, pretty significant if we don't do that. You know, and we work really closely with the boroughs and Thames Water. I suppose the issue for us is around resources, because there are so many boroughs in London, and making sure that that communication happens with every single one of them. And out of hours as well, you know, making sure that someone there's a single point of contact, you know, 24/7, 365 days a year. We have, you know, an incident management system that allows us to ensure that, you know, we have somebody on duty all that time to be able to explain what we're seeing and what action they could take. But all of this is set out in the multi-agency flood plan that the London Resilience Forum wrote a while ago and has been reviewed recently, and we constantly input to. So all of the actions, the trigger points, the sort of multiple issues that go on are, you know, set out in that document.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblymember McCartney.
Thank you. I just want to pick up, Charlie, if I can, about something you've just said about other waterways. Because obviously poorly maintained waterways can have an impact as well. And I'm not just talking about major rivers, but, for example, my constituency, you know, the Pims Brook and Salmons Brook have caused flooding to properties. And before, are our waterways sufficiently maintained at the moment? And what does the Environment Agency do about working with local boroughs to identify where existing waterways could be a potential flood risk, and then I suppose what remedial action can be taken? And is it just a question of funding?
So, yeah, it's a really good question, because it is, you know, as Alex pointed out, you know, being clear who's responsible for what. And when you get into the main river and then the tributaries, ensuring that we're clear who's responsible for that maintenance on those systems is incredibly important. Just as others have said, you know, all of the rivers are mapped. We're clear where the pinch points are in those rivers, and you know, we will regularly go out and check the rivers. So there's a clear maintenance programme. We have as much money as we are given from government to go and do that. And so are the boroughs, but we do talk to them regularly. So when we know, you know, that we have particular hotspots or pinch points, you know, we will work with them to ensure that they're cleared. And if we know that a particular weather system's coming in and we know that those particular areas are difficult, you know, we will assist the boroughs to help with that localised issue where we can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Assemblymember Cooper.
Yeah, I'd like to come to Professor Lowe, so I'm not quite sure which direction to look in. Thank you very much for joining via the internet. And this section, we wanted to ask some questions about rising temperatures and heat waves that you thought you might be able to help us with. And if you could just describe how London experiences the urban heat island effect currently, and what more can be done to alleviate the impact of the urban heat island effect on London, particularly going forward.
Yeah, I can come in on those. So firstly, just thinking about temperature more generally. So how we project temperature in our climate models, they include a representation of the urban area. So they actually build in the urban heat island to the high resolution climate projections. And so the numbers I talked about at the start in terms of warming for London, for instance, between 1.9 and 4.1 degrees C by the 2050s, that factors in the urban heat island in the first instance. And we can also look to see how high temperature events from the past might change in the future. So the event, the summer we had in 2018, that had a chance of happening in any given year.
Oh. We've just lost you.
Okay,
Oh,
hopefully
there we go. We
I
got
can see
as
you
far
again now.
as the summer of 2018 and then nothing.
Yeah, so the type of summer we had in 2018, that in present day climate, you'd expect to have a probability any given year between about 10 and 25%. By the middle of the century, you'd expect that probability to rise to 50%. So on average, every other year could be like 2018. And by you'd expect the 2018 summer actually to be quite a rare event. Now, the urban heat island, we've seen trends in the difference between the urban area and the surrounding rural area that have been changing over time. It's especially noticeable in the nighttime minimum temperatures. In terms of the magnitude of the urban heat island effect, if you look averaged over the city as a whole, then it's typically of the order of 1.5 degrees up to 3 degrees. But there will be times when there are parts of the city that are even warmer. And so you may have seen heat maps where this goes up to 7 or 8 degrees. But the average is a bit lower. The future trend extracted from our regional model is that during the day, we're not expecting to see a big increase in the urban heat component, urban heat island component. During the night, we could see a trend of the order of 0.05 per decade. And just to comment, that's already in the projections.
I mean, that's a huge difference for people who are living in London, and I'm particularly struck because I've seen a lot of buildings going up that, you know, in continental Europe, where they do have higher heats because it's the continental landmass, and the same in the States, but particularly in Europe, a lot of people avoid the use of air conditioning, which obviously has its own impacts in terms of energy use, by having very good external shuttering, which is also helpful for cold in the winter, but also shading. Now, we seem to have moved away from that here and having awnings and shading. I mean, I am quite concerned that some of the buildings that have been going up don't have adequate protection to the levels of heat that we have now due to the urban heat island. But you seem to be saying it could be even worse. And if it gets very, very much worse at night particularly, then obviously the ambient temperature during the day in some of those flats, particularly if they've got large windows, which people do like, so that these could be very serious impacts from what you're saying.
Yeah, so just to be clear, in terms of peak temperatures will still occur during the day. But I was referring to the change in the urban heat island, particularly manifesting at night. But we do expect to see the changes in the daytime temperature. In terms of adaptations, there are a range of things that can be done. Some of them are behavioural, so making sure people actually do see the warnings and know what to do when there is a heat health warning, so staying hydrated, for instance, seeking out cool spaces. In terms of more engineering type solutions, then there is a raft of measures. So some of those involve shading, some of those involve changes to building design to improve ventilation. Some of them involve some of the things we've already talked about for flooding, like green roofs, that provide a sponge effect and allow for latent heat cooling at night. And creating more green spaces in cities is something that has been studied in a number of cases. There are also some, I think, very useful examples that one can find from cities around the world that are already applying some of the measures to deal with high temperatures. And projects like the C40 Cities Network have a climate hub that does so, and the Climate Adapt programme. So it's possible to compare the effectiveness of these different measures. Now that information is out there.
Yes, I mean, clearly there are a number of cities around the world where temperatures are much, much higher than London, so learning the lessons through the C40 cities cooling Cooler Cities group and those sorts of things, I think is very helpful. I just wondered if I could move on from you, Jason. Thank you very much for that very helpful answers there. To you, Peter, and it's just what further steps can the Mayor take to reduce the impact of heat waves on London's citizens, businesses and services? And obviously he is very involved in the C40 Cities group, and perhaps there's some messages that he and some of the team have been able to bring back from that would be useful to us now.
So I think Professor Lowe has helpfully covered a number of things that we are all already sort of working on, but I would just sort of emphasise again, you know, the London plan is really, really important here for new build, and we're encouraging developers as part of the London plan and new developments to include robust overheating modelling, so against the sort of extreme weather scenarios. And the plan's also got a cooling hierarchy, which is to ensure that overheating risk is managed. And again, that hierarchy is trying to focus first and foremost on managing out heating risk, as I think I mentioned earlier, in the design of buildings, rather than sort of relying on mechanical solutions such as air conditioning, which of course can add to the problem as well. The professor talked about sort of shading. That's obviously really important as part of that work, and we are sort of pushing that quite hard through. Looked at particular vulnerable groups, so just to sort of mention a couple. One is sort of education early years settings, where we've produced a guidance, simple guidance for education authorities and to sort of implement measures in their schools and settings to sort of help them adapt to sort of warmer temperatures. We also undertook some work around care homes, so I'm sure you appreciate that the risk is far greater to elderly people from sort of high temperatures, and that's work we did with University College London and Oxford Brookes University, and with the Public Health England, just looking at simple measures that could be taken. So we undertook that in five care homes and made recommendations on what they could do. We've produced a checklist also to help with sort of making care homes better prepared, and the Care Quality Commission is now committed to including that sort of assessment of risk of overheating in their own inspection assessments of care homes as well, and using that sort of simple checklist. I mentioned already the Cool Spaces programme to help, whilst it doesn't solve the problem, but it's helping with sort of respite for Londoners when they're out and about. So we have 313 outdoor spaces and 43 indoor spaces so far, and we continue to work with faith groups and boroughs and others to identify and grow that network. And also, you know, tied, I think, to the Zero Carbon Challenge, we have a lot of buildings that we need to retrofit in London, both commercial and sort of homes. And an important part of that is thinking about ventilation and not just making buildings sort of airtight. So as part of our approach to the Warmer Homes Initiative, it's also thinking about how we make effective interventions to make those buildings cooler. Things like tree planting we have underway, other efforts through sort of green roofs, etc., to kind of cool the city as well.
So when the London Environment Strategy was first being drafted and was agreed in May 2018, subsequent to that, the Assembly declared a climate emergency in December 2018, and the London plan had largely been written at that point. The examination in public then took place in early 2019, and you know, a lot of proposals were put forward, particularly by myself, Caroline Russell, Nikki Gavron spent a lot of time you know, saying maybe some additional areas around this should be considered. With the change from the Mayor saying zero carbon by 2050 to saying zero carbon by 2030, have you been looking again at the London plan and the environment strategy in terms of what we need to do, not just in terms of flooding or in terms of energy use, but also in terms of addressing the heating situation in the city and overheating particularly?
So there's work underway around the London plan at the moment to do that, some longer term thinking. It never seems to end right, the London plan, about what might be needed going forward. So I would expect that we will feed in as part of that review, the growing challenges that we are facing. The Green New Deal mission is a good example, I think, of where we are sort of proactively then taking forward more sort of measures which are trying to bring together a range of different things, from sort of creating economic opportunity and jobs through to sort of making London sort of better prepared to the impacts of things like and the recovery from the pandemic, but also better prepared to cope with climate as well. So a number of the initiatives I've already mentioned have been born out of that. So there is an evolving, I think, programme of work. Again, I mentioned earlier, one of the areas we are currently looking at is around a cool roofs initiative as well. Is there more we could do effectively to make London's roofs reflective, in essence, to sort of reduce the urban heat island effect? So there's a sort of constant programme of work underway to sort of respond to the needs we have. And Lily might want to just talk about some of the things TfL are doing to sort of mitigate heat on the transport network as well.
Well, that would be interesting. And it would, so following on from what Hina was talking about, it would certainly be interesting to hear that TfL isn't going to keep on putting in impermeable road surfaces without having some, mitigation in terms of adding in additional trees and shrubs. And I've still seen road schemes going in that look like that. All the recent street space that included lots of floating bus stops, but not enough shrubs, in my view. So there still seems to be a lot of ability to change London, but without really starting to address this, because we know that it reflects the heat away. If you leave the surface there, then it can also absorb the floods that we were talking about earlier, but it does also cool. And having people boiling at bus stops isn't really something that we want to see.
Okay, I agree. I mean, just in terms of the general approach to dealing with heat, it's clearly something that's really, really important to our customers, and we get a lot of feedback on that already. And when we look at reports looking at what that might mean in terms of climate change and the impacts on the tube, we can see that there's going to be more and more days where it's going to be uncomfortably hot. So there has been quite a lot of, if I just start with the tube and then move on to the red network, there has been quite a lot of work that's already been done and been put in place, from the sort of softer end, the behavioural measures, where we have a clear sort of hot weather plan, and that involves advising customers about the need to carry water, advising them about heat, encouraging those who may be concerned about it to be aware, through to actual physical improvements with more fresh air vents into the Victoria line, the Northern line. 40% of tube trains now have air conditioning. Circle Line, District Line, Metropolitan Line, Hammersmith and City Line. All the new Elizabeth Line trains will have air conditioning. So this is a modern network, and it is trying to adapt. But clearly that is going to take time in terms of the whole network being hotter climate ready. I think the connection then between the surface red network is really important, because if we can reduce above air temperatures, we can also help passengers who might be underground. And I am worried about your feedback on new schemes. I mean, actually, a lot of the new schemes under the Healthy Streets approach do include greening and climate mitigation measures. The Old Street scheme that's going in, for example, that not so much the greening side of things, but has a lot of sort of flood attenuation built into it. And if you have specific local examples, I'm always welcome to get some feedback on that and take it back to the designers around TfL, because we are seeking to build our tree cover on the main road network exactly because we have a target to increase that tree cover. So I love trees, so I would absolutely like to see this roll forward. It is very much part of our policy to increase tree cover as part of street design. It may be that were some of the more rapid street space schemes that came in quickly over the pandemic period. Those are now, many of them, being made permanent, so there's an opportunity there to look at that.
I know why you haven't been able to put trees in. It's because the northern line from the northern line extension heading south to Morden essentially follows the A24. Just as I know Thames Water, some of their assets are very close to, for example, the pipework that had to be fixed that actually goes over where the district line runs at Southfields. So sometimes there's more than one thing that's going on. However, we have got very good examples here of some very, very large containers with trees around the Moor London estate, very close to here. So I know why things can't, because at one point people were talking about the Balham Boulevard and they wanted trees planted down the middle of the road. Unfortunately, that would then impede the northern line from running just underneath those trees, unless you can think of a way to get tube trains to run through routes. But perhaps that's something we can take offline, because I'm sure the chair is keen to move on because we are running a bit slow. Late.
I'd like to, and also just to say, we need to continue to challenge ourselves and see what more we can do in that. So that feedback's really welcome.
But shrubs, I did mention shrubs as well.
So
shrubs as well as trees, I think, are really important for that reason.
Thank you both very much. That concludes part one. So thank you very much to our guests. Thank you for joining us, and also, of course, to our virtual guest, Professor Lowe. Thank you. I'm going to suggest to members that we continue straight on, just because we are running over time. I'd like to welcome our virtual guests for our part two.
Can I just make one final... I should have mentioned at the beginning, we didn't really have time to introduce myself, but I just wanted to make clear that I am actually a member of the Environment Agency Board, but all my comments today, obviously, as in my role as Chief Officer for TfL, I just wanted to make sure that that was noted for the minutes.
Noted. Thank you very much. And you are, of course, free to leave the chamber. Thank you very much. To our virtual guests, who I'm going to introduce, first of all, apologies for keeping you waiting. Thank you very much for joining us. Joining us virtually, Councillor Johnny Thalasites. He's lead member for Planning, Place and Environment, Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. We're joined by Chris Lee, Director of Environment and Regeneration, London Borough of Merton, and Patricia Cuervo, Senior Flood and Water Management Officer, Royal Borough of Kensington, and also Co-Chair Planning Lead of the London Drainage Engineers Group. Thank you very much and welcome all. If I can dive straight into it with Johnny Thalasites in Kensington and Chelsea. Johnny, thinking about recent extreme weather events affecting London, such as those in July 2021, what has been the impact on London boroughs?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting us today, Zach, and it's good to join your committee. I think this is an extremely important issue for us all to tackle today. In Kensington and Chelsea, the impact of recent extreme weather events has been enormous. If I just run through some of the figures that we've got from our borough alone, and I know that lots of other parts of the city were similarly affected, we know that over 200 residents have had to be accommodated in local hotels and provided with food and clothing while steps were taken to assess the extent of the damage. 3 schools had to close due to flooding at a time when we know that education has been extremely disrupted over the last 18 months. I know at least one large block of flats in my ward, Addison Court in Holland Park, where residents were trapped and unable to leave the court for almost a day as water flooded the car park area. We know that vulnerable residents had to be evacuated from a care leavers hostel and placed in temporary accommodation. And several council buildings running essential services from day centres to youth centres and libraries also were severely damaged over the course of the last couple of months. Just moving quickly on, we know that the cost of the response ran into the tens of thousands. It was over £50,000. And we currently have 8 council tenants still in TA, and work is progressing on repairs to properties. So that's a quick run through of some of the really tangible impacts. But we know that there's also a mental health impact from flooding too. Whether you've been affected in terms of having to leave your home for a period, or whether your work has been impacted. I've spent time with residents in my ward in particular, but also across Notting Hill and North Kensington, talking to them about just how much it's affected them. And I think it's important to register that that's a slightly less seen effect of flooding that we all need to be mindful of and make sure that we offer support for going forward.
Thank you, Johnny. And again, thank you for joining us. I actually have a map from the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea from 2007 that was properties flooded. Do you know if there's an intention for the borough to reproduce a map from this year?
If I may take the question, I'm Patricia Cuervo. Thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, the borough as a lead local authority would have to produce what is called a Section 19 investigation. and we will be mapping the flooding event. We have a rough idea of the most affected areas, but yeah, we will produce something probably by the end, but maybe this year or early next year. We're also waiting for the outcome of the Thames Water independent review.
Thank you, Patricia. And can I also ask you, what is your borough learning from recent extreme weather events, such as the flash flooding in July, and how are you adapting in preparation for future potential occurrences?
Okay, so I think one of the key messages that was discussed in panel 1 was that we need to improve on our response, on our working together with other boroughs and other response authorities. But we also need to understand our different roles and responsibilities as lead local authorities, as contingency planning authorities. So we need a clear understanding of our roles and how we communicate with each other. And I think in terms of surface water flood risk particularly, I think there are really quite a few key points that we need to focus on. We need to understand our assets and the assets of others. We need to understand their maintenance, their state of repair, their capacity. We also need an accurate modelling of surface water and its interaction with other types of flood risk, because water doesn't understand boundaries. So we need to know how surface water is interacting with groundwater flooding. The July event happened when there was high tidal lock, so the tide was high, and that had a quite bad consequences as a result. So we need also a proper forecasting and warning system for residents. We need a change of legislation and also change of British standards, because as a local planning authority, we need to plan for new development, need to be resilient to climate change. However, water companies don't need to plan infrastructure for resilient to climate change, and that's something that needs to change at a much higher level. It's something that boroughs cannot change. We also need to warn residents, so we need to make everyone aware that they are vulnerable to flooding and what can they do to protect themselves. And as lead local authorities, we need to be properly funded. The government has announced a £5.2 billion funding on flood risk projects, not just surface water, but flood risk projects in general. But the way of lead local authorities accessing this funding is heavily diminished because we don't have enough resources to be able to put projects forward and to implement those projects. So we really need to think outside the box, and we need to think in a holistic way and stop maybe saying surface water only is flood risk in general, and all the agencies need to work together for that.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Moving to Chris now, it's the same question but with a Merton perspective. What is your borough learning from recent occurrences and how are you adapting to avoid these in future?
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me. So thankfully the events in Merton were less impactful than those that I've just heard about from Kensington and Chelsea. But that's not to say that there isn't a problem. And despite all of our flood risk assessments and our flood management plans, Merton still suffered very significantly during the events in July. And what we're learning from that, and our partners Thames Water are learning from that, is the need for investment in an ageing infrastructure and in an infrastructure owned by Thames Water that requires probably more regular annual maintenance and some sort of planned maintenance program, because unless that infrastructure is working at the capacity for which it was designed and operating fit for purpose, these problems will recur. So as the previous respondent said, there needs to be that holistic approach and working across the agencies with the local authority to ensure that all the assets, whether they're owned by Merton, whether they're owned by Thames Water, are operating satisfactorily to ensure that these events reduce in terms of frequency. We are seeing, however, that the abnormal is becoming the normal, and even with that sort of programme that's required in order to ensure that that the water flows satisfactorily through the system. I think in the longer term, there's going to have to be more significant capital investment in order to ensure that the system is fit for purpose.
Thank you, Chris. Assembly Member Buck-Harry.
Thank you so much. This is a question for Chris Lee from Merton. Back in as far as 2007, councillors were warning and worried about what was happening in that particular borough with flash flooding. So why is it still taking so long to have some sort of action or approach to dealing with flooding proactively rather than reactively?
So I don't think there's a single bullet to resolve this problem, and it would be unfair to say that there hasn't been action since we took the lead local flood authority responsibilities at the start of the last decade. We have fulfilled our responsibilities to the letter in terms of establishing that assessment of the areas that suffer from flood risk and preparing and publishing detailed plans where we take action in order to minimise that flood risk. And that's an evolving and developing picture. So we need and do take account of recent flood events in order to inform that picture and to adapt and change our activity. But our activity is just one part in that bigger picture. So we feed our information into Thames Water and other agencies to ensure that they can take the requisite action. A lot of our work is done in terms of trying to mitigate the problem, trying to prevent the problem occurring through our activity in cleaning gullies. We have around 17,500 gullies in Merton, and we have regular programmes to clean those and the higher risk ones to clean at a more regular frequency in order to ensure that they don't contribute to the problem that we're facing. We work very closely now with Thames Water in order to ensure that the problems that we identify in their systems can be taken into account and that Thames Water can take the appropriate action. I think that needs to continue.
You've mentioned
Sorry,
you mentioned the gullies and the drains, and that's actually a particular area of interest. That I want to know how the communication between the council and the residents are ensuring that there is sufficient clearage. You know, for example, do you notify the residents when you're going to be clearing the drains so that there's adequate space for that clearage to happen? Because, for example, cars could be parked on those roads. How successful has that been? And do you think there could be some improvements?
So, firstly, we have a programme which identifies the high-risk gullies across the borough, and around 10,000 of that 17,500 are higher risk. Some of those are in town centres, some of those are in the areas which suffer more intense flooding during the high rainfall. And we have that programme of clearing those gullies. We also have a facility where residents can inform us of gullies that are blocked, and we have a 72-hour response, and we have a dedicated web page for those to be reported and for us to respond and clear those gullies. You're absolutely right, there are problems where there are parked vehicles in our streets, and London, Merton is a very heavily parked borough, and where we suffer from that, where we have vehicles parked over gullies, it's often extremely difficult to have those removed. And I think that's going to be a challenge for the future, and one that we're looking at, whereby we could seek residents to voluntarily remove their vehicles from one side of the road or the other, so that we can get that more intense clearance of the gullies and the road in order to ensure that they are dealt with on a regular basis. But I think that's going to continue to be a problem in terms of vehicle parking, and with the number of roads, with the number of streets that we have and the number of vehicles, getting a traffic management order, which we do in some instances in order to lift vehicles and remove them so that we can clean them properly. I'm sure we can improve the communications with residents in order to seek their cooperation, but that will be a constant challenge. And we do have instances where residents simply don't remove their vehicle despite our requests, and the cost and burden on the council taxpayer in having to get vehicles lifted or have the gully clearance vehicle return on a number of occasions. It is significant.
So can I suggest that the communication then between residents, councillors and officers could be improved, not just in Merton but in every council when it comes to these situations?
I'm sure there's areas that we can work on to help that, yes.
Okay. I'm going to leave it there because I know we're running out of time.
I'm not sure if Assembly Member Cooper, did you want to come in?
Oh, I think we should carry on.
Perfect, thank you very much. Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Chris and then to Johnny. How is the London Environment Strategy making a positive impact in enabling your borough to adapt to the extreme weather, please?
Maybe I'll just go first. And Merton has a climate change plan, and that climate change plan, alongside our local plan, our planning policies, is doing everything we can, responding to the environment plan, the environment strategy, in order to ensure that our policies and our actions are consistent with it, in order to ensure that we are adapting and seeking to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And that plays right into our planning policies around future development and the way that we're seeking to, particularly in relation to flood and water management, to mitigate the impact of the increased weather events that we're seeing in the borough by shifting from grey to green, by having more water attenuation, by seeking to mitigate the impact of new development and existing development on Merton and London.
Thank you. Johnny?
Thanks for the question, Tony. You'll know about a lot of the work that we've been doing to adapt to extreme weather in our borough in Kensington and Chelsea. We do use the London Environment Strategy to inform our evidence-based documents and our local plan and things like the greening SPD that we adopted last year. We're currently reviewing our local plan and intend to use the strategy to develop robust approaches to extreme weather and all associated issues. We require Suds for all new development as well, for major and minor developments. And we've also had £500,000 of funding from the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee to implement Suds in one housing estate in the borough. But we know that there's a lot more work to do, and we certainly intend to work closely with the Environment Strategy and with the Assembly to produce the right response to the flooding we've had.
Thank you very much. And my second question, and maybe Johnny can start first this time, is there are some initiatives, including the link to the Mayor's Environment Strategy, around data collection and mapping. How is the data collection, mapping and monitoring having a material impact in enabling your borough to practically adapt to the impact of climate change, please?
Thanks, Tony. I think data and mapping are both very important. We talked about it a bit earlier in relation to assets in the borough, which I think is a key component. But we do collect data and model flood risk in evidence-based documents. So, for example, in the strategic flood risk assessment, the surface water management plans that we've got, and also in informing our local plan policies and the local flood risk management strategy and action plan. So there's a lot of work happening. And this data also helps us with flood risk projects on the ground. So specifically the selection of the best possible locations for things like the implementation of Suds.
Thank you very much. Chris?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the supply of new information and that sort of accretion of data is absolutely essential to us being able to respond to this. And just one good example that we've got in Merton is that we've already installed over 60 Internet of Things devices into our high-risk gullies, and we're investing in more of those. And those provide us with real-time information about the level of silt and the impact on that gully flowing. And I think over time that will help to build that bit richer picture alongside all of the data that we're collecting around flood events, Section 19 investigations and information from other partners to add to the already rich supply of data and mapping that we have so that we can adapt and shift our resources in order to ensure that flooding becomes less of a risk in the future.
Thank you. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Bakhari.
This is to both Vicky and Chris. What's being done to improve the proportion of permeable surfaces in your borough for new and existing developments and spaces? Should we go to Chris first?
Yeah, happy to go in first. So I mentioned earlier that our planning policies are developing and adapting to seek to ensure that we have more mitigation of flooding. And one good example of that is asking developers to build rain gardens into their development. And we're also putting that into some of our infrastructure. There's one that's just about to complete now in SW19 around High Path. But in new developments on the private land, our policies seek to ensure that developers provide attenuation, that they're providing appropriate risk storage, water storage, including rain gardens, green roofs and so on. So our planning policies are just at the stage of being reviewed by the Planning Inspectorate, and they will further strengthen that in terms of the requirements to provide that sort of provision.
Comment, Chair?
Please.
Or was Johnny
sorry,
about to respond?
we don't actually have Vicky
sorry,
on the line.
I realised that when I read
but
that.
But we can still pose that same question if you wish.
If your council don't mind, yeah. And I do need to just have something slight to add to that. Do they not?
If you want to pose that question to Patricia, because she's London.
Yeah, I'll ask again, Patricia. Sure. What is being done to improve the proportion of permeable surfaces in your borough?
Yes. So we have a specific policy on sustainable urban drainage system, and we went one step further than the London plan. So instead of just requiring a very big reduction of surface water on major development, we also require 50% reduction on small development, which is what we get quite a lot in inner London boroughs. So for any rear extension or side extension or basement development, we will require the whole of the site to be, the whole of the runoff from the site to be reduced by 50%. So that is one of the policies that we introduced in 2019, and I can assure that we're getting quite a lot of development with new sites. The other thing that we have is a policy on new permeable surfaces for all landscape areas, because planning policy or the permitted development rights allow for rear gardens to be paved over without any need for planning permission, because it's not considered development, paving of the rear gardens. So front gardens are protected in a way, but not rear gardens. And we introduced a new policy on protecting all landscape areas or open areas within the site. So that is for development, that new development that is happening. But we definitely need to do more, not just us in Kensington, but everyone everywhere in London or any big city to repave existing development and existing areas when we're doing other works as local authorities, highways, etc., in our own buildings, and encourage other people to introduce permeable surfaces and more green infrastructure.
Thank you. So what do both the councils do when there's a breach of planning guidance? In 2008, it was very clearly made out that if you were to pave over your front gardens, that would be a breach. Is there any way that you're publicising this kind of guidance, providing information for people, because they are paving over their front gardens to allow, for example, having electric cars to be charged? What kind of action are you taking against these kind of issues that are propping up now in front gardens?
I can go first if you want. So for the front gardens, you can pave over 5 square meters, but more than that, if you pave more than 5 square meters, you will need to direct the surface runoff into green areas, or you need to use permeable paving, and then you'll be fine. You have permitted development rights for that. What we do to publicise that, we have it on our planning webpage, and on our Suds webpage, and on our greening SPD, actually, we included a small section of that to make sure the residents know what they can do. I also think that is on the householders guides of the greening SPD. So yes, that's what we're doing. In terms of how we ensure that any breach are looked at, we have a planning enforcement team, and they work either proactively by looking at if development has been implemented according to the conditions of the planning permission granted. And we also get residents calling us in and saying, actually, we don't think that this development is being implemented according to the plans and according to the conditions. So we go and check.
And is there any enforcement in Merton?
Well, the situation is almost identical in terms of the obviously the statutory position and the permitted development rights, and where there are breaches, they are reported or can be reported to planning enforcement. I'm not aware of instances where planning enforcement has had to take action in order to reverse the position and to take the development out, but I'm happy to investigate that.
No, I'd like to hear
but
from
point,
that, yeah.
the point I think is well made, that sustainable drainage is absolutely essential if we're going to mitigate the flooding risk that we face. And we do need to keep an eye on where non-permeable surfaces that aren't consistent with the permitted development rights are being installed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you, Chair. And welcome to the panel. I've got a slightly croaky voice, so just let me know if you need me to repeat anything, but I can't promise I'd be any clearer the second time. So building on some of what we've been talking about, especially in regarding to planning enforcement, I think it was a very interesting conversation because our previous panel, we had someone from the Environment Agency who did talk about there are applications that pass that don't adhere to the advice or the recommendations of the planning of the Environment Agency. And so it's good to hear from both yourself, Chris, and I think you also came in as well, Vicky and Johnny, on sort of planning enforcement and ensuring that actually we do have applications that comply not only with the London plan but with the advice of the Environment Agency, ensuring that we do minimise the risks. And I think part of it also is perhaps we haven't really seen the seriousness of flooding that have more recently come onto our streets. So perhaps culturally we're still catching up. So here's hoping we continue improving. I just wanted to build on, again, what we've been talking about regarding surface water flooding risks. And I wanted to ask all of you what you think needs to be done in London so that we have fully adapted to surface water flooding risks caused by climate change. So what support, what mechanisms, if there were far-reaching sort of visions and action plans, it'd be really good to hear from you about what they are. And I don't have a preference as to who goes first, so whoever jumps in, basically.
Okay, why don't I start then? It's a really good question, and I agree with all of the comments you've made, but largely I think I'd refer to some of the points we've been making over the course of this morning and this early afternoon. So particularly about understanding our existing asset ownership, maintenance, repair capacity, making sure we've got accurate modelling of surface water and its interaction with other types of flood risks, so that's sewer flooding, fluvial flooding, tidal lock and groundwater, a proper forecasting and warning system, legislative change where necessary so that climate change isn't only accounted for in a new development but also in the water industry and by all RMAs. And we also need to do an educational piece, making sure that people understand the risks that are associated with extreme weather like flooding in our city. We need properly funded LLFAs and lead local flooding authorities and RMAs who can access government funds. And we also need to think outside the box, I would suggest, to understand and to try to mitigate what will happen soon when these events do become more frequent. So those are all points that I think reflect what might be done, particularly in London, but also nationally. And then locally, obviously, things we've been talking about in terms of the local plan, some of the resilience work that we're doing in policy and enforcement terms, and also continuing to work with partners. I think a joined up approach is extremely important, and making sure that, for example, Thames Water are playing their part, ensuring that major projects like Counters Creek in our part of London and Thames Tideway that are associated with water and related impacts are taken forward in a timely way and in a way that's value for money for citizens of the city, are all things that we can help make happen so that flooding and surface water risk is reduced.
Thank you, Johnny. Vicky or Chris, I don't know if you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, just to add to that, I suppose a couple of things. I suppose raising awareness generally across London for existing landowners to think about how they could adapt their property, even if it's not subject to development, how they could return grey surfaces to green to assist with the challenge that we all face. So that general awareness raising so that the problem is understood and people see how they can deal with it. And the second point is, I suppose, around materials research. Because that may deliver some opportunities to be able to tackle the problem in new and innovative ways. Because so much of our city is covered with hard surfaces, and the replacement of some of those hard surfaces in a way which uses new materials could assist. And then the point around funding, I think, can't be underplayed in terms of the lead local flood authorities available resources to work with other agencies, to work with developers to ensure that we can develop the city in a way which doesn't add to the problem, but hopefully reduces that problem over time.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think it's good throughout this meeting that planning has been at the absolute core, and that sort of mitigation more than adaptation, or adaptation and mitigation rather, in terms of our strategies going forward. Because I think, the idea of thinking outside of the box, Johnny, I think the cultural change we also need to see across the UK in terms of bringing people on a journey about how our very infrastructure of our city has to change in order to adapt to climate change, has perhaps kind of come harsher than we'd hoped it would through the floods. And actually I think that thinking outside of the box and doing so very rapidly in terms of how we make people feel positive about the infrastructural changes that are needed because of climate change is essential for us to see that behaviour change. So I think sort of it leads into my next question really, which is how can we encourage behavioural change, and what kind of behavioural changes do we need to encourage for our citizens in regards to flooding and general climate change adaptation?
Happy to take that question. So I think the first thing that we need to do is to make residents aware of the risk that they are at, because one of the lessons learned from us was that residents didn't know that they were at flood risk, at this type of flood risk. So they were really totally unaware, and that's really dangerous when you have sewer water flooding and you have basement properties used for sleeping accommodation. Extremely dangerous. So that is one of the things that we need to be better at. So we need to tell everyone, or at least share the information on which properties are at risk. The information is out there, but I think it's only being looked at when these type of events happen. Really, people don't only worry about flooding when it happens, rather than before it happens. So that's one of the things that we need to do, make citizens aware that they are at risk of flooding. And then we also need to ensure, I mean, I don't know how, but we need to make them take their own responsibility for flood risk. So they need to have good insurance that covers this type of risk, and they need to have practical measures, like, for example, contingency plan or flood plan. They need to see if they need any flood risk, any measures to protect the property, which are called property level protection measures. And we also need to send a message out. For example, we had a big scheme in the borough, the Countess Creek, you referred to it before, and it involved one of the parts of the project involved a large sewer enlargement, which would take about 3 years to construct, and it was some of the sites were really highly built up residential areas, and most of the residents living in the area, most of the residents that haven't been flooded in 2007 living in the area, they were totally opposed to this type of obviously of construction impact. So we need to make people aware that these infrastructure projects needs to happen as well, and they will need to think about not only think about the temporary construction impact that they're going to suffer, but also the benefits that the long-term benefits that they will have. So we need to make people aware and us aware that we're not going to solve this problem by only doing green infrastructure. Green infrastructure is great, but we have a big problem. It would also require kind of pipes and sewer infrastructure, and we need to make sure that we're all on the same line. So understand that there are some type of impacts that we're going to suffer for this time, but to make sure that we reduce flood risk in the future. I think it's key. The key message that we need to tell, and it's very difficult to convey this message, is that we cannot stop flooding from happening, and this would only get worse. So we need to make sure that we adapt to it and we try to reduce the consequences of flooding. But the message of we will not be able to stop it is key, and everyone needs to be responsible for their own safety as well. So yeah, that's what I think we need to tell residents.
Thank you, Vicky. I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in, because I was otherwise just going to reflect on some of what you've just said. I'll take that as a no. I mean, I think the sort of behavioural change, the sort of embedding the idea of not panic, but responsibility in terms of expectations around flood risks is vital. And if I might be, I think it's always important as politicians to put things in the wider context. And I think it's not, I think comms around this will be key in terms of that, bringing people on a journey and that cultural change around our behaviour of climate change. But I think also putting this in the context nationally and internationally. I think people shouldn't have to feel like they are the only ones doing the heavy lifting to mitigate against climate change. We need to make sure the government is also doing the heavy lifting in terms of bringing in accountability around fossil fuel companies. And I think internationally as well, I think it's important to put in the context that these floodings that we've seen that have been devastating for the UK, and it really saddens me that so many people have had to suffer, has also been happening for many years in many countries around the world. In Bangladesh, for instance, the level of flooding is extremely intense, and small state islands are also highly at risk. And this is totally related to what's happening here in London and the UK, because it is climate change at the heart of this. So this sort of international, national, and then regional and local action has to all be in sync in terms of actually activating behavioural change. I'll wrap up with this final question, and this is around flooding incidents. And we've spoken already a little bit about this, but it would just be good to tease out your answers again. Are you satisfied, and how do you communicate with Thames Water and London Fire Brigade to help identify the most vulnerable residents when we do have extreme flooding? And what improvements can we hope for if there needs to be some?
I think one of the lessons learned from this flooding event is that we need to improve our communication with Thames Water. We have been talking to Thames Water, and they say that they have improved their phone facilities, because at the time it happened, we're aware that some residents couldn't get through them, but they have improved their facilities, and they have also given us a direct line to talk to them as officers in an emergency response. So I think that has, or hopefully will have a very positive impact when the next event happens.
And if I could just add, I think our mapping systems in Merton are quite advanced and sophisticated, so we can identify the areas of the borough that are more susceptible, more at high risk. And we can identify those households that are vulnerable. And I suppose if COVID has helped us with anything, it has helped us to improve our connectivity with residents right around the borough in terms of identifying vulnerability and need. Our relationship with the London Fire Brigade is very good. Our relationship with Thames Water is good and improving. I think that bodes well for the future in terms of us being able to ensure that we respond as quickly and as efficiently as we can with those other agencies to support those who are most at need in the event of flooding.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Sheikh. Just picking up on the theme there, if I can come back to Johnny, particularly around the planning theme. A few weeks ago, I met the amazing campaigners at Save the Earls Court campaign, and they were talking about the kind of dead space that we often see around lots of places in London, but particularly the wasteland that's currently there at Earls Court. Do you see a role with that space in greening it that will deal with some of the issues that we've been speaking about today?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I've spent a lot of time. I've met with the Save Arts Corp campaign too, and I admire their passion and their interest in the area. I certainly think there's an opportunity to implement green infrastructure on a very green site on the Arts Court opportunity area. It is one of the major opportunities in our borough to develop something really special. I would love to think that there will be, and we will certainly be pressing for in our policies support all the kinds of sustainable drainage and green infrastructure we've been talking about today. So absolutely I share the aspiration that it will make a contribution towards mitigating flood risk. And I do think that it stands almost alone alongside probably Kensal Canal side as one of the key sites in Kensington and Chelsea that can make a significant contribution on many fronts to the challenges that we face at a sort of almost a regional level too.
Thank you for that. I also spoke to Councillor Wade and she talked about the possibility of a super sewer along Warwick Road. I just wondered if you had any reflections on, not just for Kensington, but more generally, that kind of infrastructure along the Suds.
What do you mean super sewer? The Countess Creek sewer enlargement?
Exactly, where the intersection is, looking at both the combination of that and Suds.
Yeah. We as a council support the sewer enlargement, which was part of the Countess Creek storm alleviation scheme, and it had other elements to it, like local enlargement, local pumping stations, pumps for basement properties, and sustainable urban drainage systems within Kensington and Chelsea and Hammersmith and Fulham. So we do support it, but one of the information that we're gonna get out of the independent review, the Thames Water independent review, would be how would have this sewer enlargement behaved, or how would it have helped if it were built in July, by obviously July this year, in terms of reducing the flood risk consequences. So we would be very interested in knowing what would have happened if that sewer was built. But we definitely support any infrastructure that is going to reduce the flood risk in the borough.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, we certainly do strongly support building out Countess Creek, and I think it's a disappointment that it hasn't been done yet. So whilst we recognise there are financial challenges associated with delivering a project of that scale, we absolutely want to see it in the next business plan. We want it to be delivered as soon as possible. I've met personally with senior representatives at Thames Water and encouraged them to do that, and it's something that we intend to keep lobbying for. I've met a number of residents across the borough who have asked us about that. There was awareness of it in the borough as a project that we hope would start to mitigate some of the flood risk. And if Councillor Wade is an ally in that, then I'm very happy to work cross-party within our borough to try and produce the best outcome for residents, because I think an issue like flooding with such serious impacts on people's lives and livelihoods requires a joined-up response.
Thank you both very much. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. We've just heard from our previous panel about the impact of the urban heat island effect and how that might particularly be impacting at night, and that we could be 1.5 to 3 degrees higher than surrounding areas, but even warmer at night. And I just wondered if Chris, but maybe Patricia, Vicky, I'm not sure how much this would be your area so much. What is happening in your borough to increase surface area cooling, for example, through urban greening, which obviously does have some flood mitigation as well, which is why Vicky and Patricia may also want to come in on that.
Yeah, happy to start. So I suppose the planning policies that we have are seeking to ensure that future development reduces overheating. And as I said earlier, those are just going through a planning inquiry later this year. So we hope to adopt the most advanced policies in terms of future development. We're blessed in Merton with an abundance of green spaces, over 110 parks and open spaces. And we are more heavily treed, if such a verb exists, in terms of the tree cover that we have in the borough, which we seek to maintain and enhance. So we do have plans for more tree planting principally within our parks because they're easier and cheaper to maintain, but also on streets as well because of the canopy cover they provide in order to keep our streets cooler. And some parts of the borough benefit from more trees than others. So we're looking at planting more trees in those areas which are currently deficient or relatively deficient. So those two areas of activity.
Thank you. Would Patricia or Vicky want to come in?
Yes, I will support what Chris has said in terms of new development. We have policies on, and actually we also follow the London plan on streetscape, layout of the building, orientations to facilitate kind of a natural cooling rather than cooling by other mechanical ways. Then we are also planting additional trees, and we have a heat wave plan, which is what would happen if the temperatures kind of increase rapidly. So the heat wave plan has different kind of levels of or degree of implementation of practical measures, such as talking to vulnerable people, providing water and ice, talking to GPs, etc., etc. So there is we are trying to put measures in place for new development, but also for existing development, and for what would happen when it does happen. There is a plan.
So in terms of behaviour change, which is obviously quite an important area when responding to heatwave, Chris, is that something, given your sort of environment and regen remits, that you are advising property developers around things like shading and awnings and shutters, and also in the event of a heat wave, in the way that we were just discussing, is that something that the borough responds to by sending out notices to people, alerting people through local WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups, or if there's longer, perhaps even leaflets to people? Do you pick things up particularly in care homes, things like that? We were talking about that earlier as well, and obviously they're overheating, the excess summer deaths particularly affects the older resident and the younger resident, just as the excess winter deaths tends to impact on those people. Is there something that the borough is doing around that?
There is, but I suspect there's more we could do. So our emergency planning team are well hooked into those supplies of information around extreme weather events, and ensure that that information is disseminated on a daily basis where necessary to those staff across the organisation. So, for example, it can go out to care homes so they take extra precautions, so that our parking staff on the streets can make sure they put on sunscreen and carry extra water with them. I think we need to do more to get that message out to residents and to the community more consistently, and that's something that we'll be looking at. Our climate change plan anticipates many of these changes that we'll be facing in the city over the years to come, and we'll be working on how we improve our engagement with residents and raising awareness, and how we can adapt to those sorts of events and get that behaviour change. I think that's going to be the most challenging issue here. How do we use the most modern techniques in order to make people aware but not panic, and to make sure that we get the right behaviour change to adapt for the future.
And so in terms of the Cool Spaces initiative, how involved is the borough in that, and what has been the local impact so far?
So we're absolutely aware of the Cool Spaces initiative, and we've got a number of cool spaces in the borough in terms of our parks and open spaces, which have an abundance of shade and protection, and we'll continue to remain involved and engaged in that process.
I mean, I'm hoping that the advent of the pocket park and seeing more of those is going to be a way to create more of those cool spaces and getting those trees planted down the street, so it's not just in the wider open spaces as we were referring to earlier. But I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you very much.
With you there, Assembly Member Cooper. Assembly Member Best.
Chair, it seems we've clawed back on time, so I can really go for the supplementaries. Just to Kensington and Chelsea contingent, please. How is your borough working to ensure that the most vulnerable citizens are being protected against effects of extreme heat in London, such as the elderly and children?
Thank you. I think that's a really important question. We're ensuring that the local plan addresses extreme weather in new development and that streetscape layout and orientation of buildings enhance natural ventilation. The provision of green infrastructure is also reducing the heat island effects, and as we've been talking about, additional street trees being planted and parks have been added to the LGA's cool programme. The greening SPD that I mentioned a bit earlier today, particularly the section on building design, shows that B-Lean is at the top of our energy hierarchy. Chapter 5 deals with orientation and issues such as the glazing ratio, which I think is valuable. And the other element that might be useful is in Chapter 11, which is dealing with urban greening. So the green walls and roofs can be looked at in particular. So all of these sorts of things can help. But I certainly think Chapter 5, which is aimed at new building in particular, and retrofitting existing buildings by greening, as in Chapter 11, may assist. As we've talked a little bit about, we've also got our heatwave plan that deals with different health alert levels and actions of warning, meetings and practical measures. So things like measuring temperatures in locations used by vulnerable people, provisional cold water and ice, and phoning of visiting vulnerable residents, like liaising with GPs as well, are all things that we can do to try and protect the most vulnerable in the case of extreme heat in London, as we've been starting to see more and more of.
Thanks for that, Johnny. What could the Mayor do to support you in those initiatives?
Well, I certainly think that there's a lot more that we can always do, and I think more joined up working in terms of producing policy. So where possible, I think we want to feed into future London plans and look at accessing funding to try and deliver more green infrastructure. There are things that we can work together on, and as I said before, I think working with the Mayor's office and anybody with an interest in the issues would certainly be valuable for us.
Thank you. Is there anything specifically you're doing to work with care homes in Chelsea and Kensington to protect those residents?
Yeah. As Johnny said, the heatwave plan talks about different actions, and the hotter it gets, the more kind of specific the action is. So our colleagues in contingency planning will be talking to care homes and will be advising them on different measures that they can take. And also, not just care homes, but also the GP and local GPs that might provide further information on further practical measures that can be implemented. That's what we're doing at the moment.
Thank you. And do you believe that the policies in the London plan, such as the management of heat risk policy, contains the provision to ensure that new large developments do not overheat? Do you believe those are working?
Well, I'm not specialised on that, on heat, on the orientation and layout of buildings. But yes, the London plan has always been a reference to us on any specific policies trying to address climate change. And I would assume that they do have a positive effect, and therefore we kind of asking for them to be implemented in our new developments.
Okay. So I suppose you wouldn't reflect there's anything that you'd like to see extra in the London plan at this point?
No, for the time being.
Thanks. And just finally, Chair, for me, coming on to Assembly Member Cooper talked about the cooling initiatives. Are there any schools in your borough that have delivered the C40 Cooling Schools initiative?
I'm not aware of any off the top of my head, but I certainly think it's something we'd like to look at, and we're in close dialogue with schools about issues like flooding. As I talked about earlier, over the course of the recent floods that we had, At least 3 schools were affected and had to close for a period. So it's something that we're certainly liaising with closely, and I'm working with colleagues on.
And Chris, could I ask the same to you quickly as well? Sorry, if any of you've done any C40 cooling schools initiatives?
I'm sorry, I'm not aware of that at all.
Okay, I'd suggest maybe a scheme that could do with some more promotion and information then, Chair, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Sounds like it. Thank you very much, Assembly Member Best. Thank you all very much. Thank you to our panel. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Chris, Patricia and Johnny. Really appreciated your contributions. And thank you to my fellow Assembly members for keeping their contributions brief and concise. We ended on time. Please do feel free to leave the Zoom call now. We've just got a few more items of business to deal with. Thanks again. So the committee is recommended to A, note the report as background to putting questions to invited guests and note the subsequent discussion, and B, delegate authority to myself as chair in consultation with the deputy chairperson and party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting. Can we agree the recommendations?
Agreed.
Thank you. Environment Committee work programme. Can we note the committee's work programme and meeting dates?
Agreed.
Thank you. Date of next meeting. The next meeting of the committee will take place on Monday the 15th of November 2021 here in the chamber at City Hall. There is no urgent business. Thank you very much.
GLA Chamber.